In the office, a man sat across from the girl, adjusting his glasses. He excitedly told her she wouldn't die, as she had been misdiagnosed. He asked for her forgiveness. The girl, her violet eyes wide with shock, could hardly believe his words. Just recently, Lariette Blanchett had been diagnosed with only 3 months to live. Nervously, she laughed. She had spent those months doing everything she'd ever wanted, believing her death was near. The doctor, however, was confused by her reaction, thinking the news would bring her relief. But Larette's mind was already spinning. She was being pursued by Duke Candle, the great sword of the Empire and god of war, who had sworn to find her wherever she might go. Now, learning that she'd never been sick at all, she felt utterly lost. Jumping out of her chair in a panic, she couldn't understand how to process the new reality. Meanwhile, the doctor, oblivious to her inner turmoil, shared in the joy of the good news. It had all begun 3 months earlier. Lariette had started feeling strange and decided to visit a doctor. She had complained of insomnia and feeling unwell after eating spicy food, as if her heart was racing. After listening to her symptoms, the doctor adjusted his glasses and warned her not to be shocked, as he suspected she had Radura disease, a rare and incurable condition. On hearing this, Lariette was stunned. The doctor explained that Radura occurred in individuals born with an excess of mana and had a 98% fatality rate. He then dropped the devastating news. She had 3 months to live. In a daze, Lariette barely remembered leaving the office. She wasn't ready to die, so she resolved to make a bucket list and complete every item on it. Back in her room, Lariette sat as her maid, Anne, combed her pink hair. Suddenly, Lariette declared that she would fulfill her entire list before she died. She turned to Anne and asked what she would do if she had only a short time left to live. Anne, caught off guard by the unusual question, quickly composed herself, picked up the comb and playfully spoke into it as though it were a microphone. She declared that besides wanting to serve her lady until death, nothing else came to mind. Lariette, touched by her maid's loyalty, told Anne she wanted to buy all kinds of cakes and take a bite of each, without caring about the waste. Ignoring Anne's practical concerns, Lariette insisted on her plan. However, Anne directed her lady to dinner with her family, knowing they couldn't miss the meal. Lariette wasn't eager to go. She had a strained relationship with her family, and sitting at the same table with them was always a challenge. Her father, the 5th Grand Duke of Blanc, was bent on selling her off to a wealthy older marquis to salvage the family's finances. Once a powerful and influential family, they had gone bankrupt. Her mother, Duchess Blanchett, shared her husband's ambitions, pushing Lariette to marry for money. Lariette, despite being the second child, had received no formal support or education. Her brother Ron, the beloved heir, had completed all the inheritance courses, while she was only trained to work in his office as an assistant. Still, Lariette played the part of a naive fool, knowing it was safest to stay silent, to avoid her family's ire. Suddenly, her older brother Ron burst into the dining room. Loved by the family, he always looked down on Lariette. With an irritated tone, he asked why she was there. Unfazed, Lariette calmly replied that she was also part of the family, and had every right to be at the table. The main character suddenly grinned and asked her brother if he was struggling with his studies, mentioning that Joel, their personal magic tutor, had been unusually quiet and gloomy lately. This remark visibly embarrassed Ron, and Lariette couldn't help but smirk to herself. She knew she could outshine her idiot brother if she wanted to. In response, Ron grabbed a glass from the table and, with an exaggerated "oops," poured its contents over Larette's head, drenching her hair and staining her dress. His actions were obviously out of spite, though he pretended it was an accident. Looking at her with a dissatisfied sneer, he announced that she had ruined his appetite. Turning to their parents, Ron said he wouldn't eat until his sister left the room. Lariette stared at him with eyes full of hatred, waiting for her parents to finally reprimand him. But instead, they shocked her by asking her not to provoke Ron and to be respectful. Her mother even ordered her to go upstairs and clean herself immediately. Stunned, Lariette had no choice but to obey. As she walked to the door, she glanced back at her family in disbelief. Her brother got away with everything, and her parents always took his side. But in that moment, Lariette didn't care. After all, she was going to die in 3 months, and none of them would care when that happened. Opening the door, she began to realize that nobody in that room would be affected by her death. This thought made her heart ache. No one needed her, and she didn't want to die being seen as a naive fool. From that moment on, Lariette decided she would live for herself and do as she pleased. Later, sitting at her desk, Lariette stared at a blank piece of paper. On April 3, 732, according to the imperial calendar, Lariette Blanchett had been given a 3-month death sentence. Quietly, she began to write her wish list for her remaining time. The list only had 5 items, some serious and others simple, but each represented her new resolve to live for herself. She completed the list with a sad smile, realizing she had no real regrets. She had devoted her entire life to her family, but now she wanted to live for herself. Her first wish was to treat Anne, her maid, to a cake. Seeing the joy on Anne's face warmed Larette's heart a little. As they travelled together in a carriage, heading somewhere special, the vehicle suddenly jolted. The girls nearly jumped from their seats. The coachman quickly apologised, explaining that one of the wheels seemed to be stuck in a hole and he would try to fix it. Lariette peeked out the window and offered to help, suggesting she could quickly handle the problem. Anne also looked out, assessing the situation. The coachman, flustered, asked them to stay inside, as it wasn't appropriate for a lady to involve herself. He then warned them to stay discreet, as a carriage belonging to Duke Candle was nearby. The Duke held a powerful position in society, and his family was considered the strongest in the empire. There were rumours that he was a monster, and even Lariette felt a twinge of fear at the thought of him. But then, hearing a strange sound, she instinctively turned toward the window. She was met by the piercing blue eyes of a man standing just outside, incredibly close. Lariette, as if enchanted, couldn't look away from him. The dark-haired man, with seemingly effortless strength, lifted their carriage with one hand, freeing the wheel from the hole. It was the Duke himself, helping them in the most unexpected way. Afterwards, the Duke turned around and walked back to his carriage, leaving Lariette to mentally thank him for his unexpected help. The Marquis of Sarah, confused by her avoidance, pulled her into an embrace, suggesting that once they were married, she would never leave their bed. Lariette recalled her to-do list for the next 3 months, and item 3 was clear. Break off the engagement to the Marquis, preferably with a scandal. The Marquis leaned in close, whispering that he found her face delicious, and that he was very attracted to her. Lariette recoiled in disgust as a sly grin spread across his face, his intentions clear. Escaping his vile embrace, Lariette realized she could no longer stand it. Item 3 had to be completed today. With a fierce determination, she began to wave her hands, casting a spell. Strange symbols appeared in the air, and a force pulled the Marquis upward, hanging him upside down. Lariette decided that today was the day to rid herself of all the unpleasant things in her life, starting with the engagement. The Blanc family had long been known for producing powerful wizards, and Lariette was no exception. She was a true sorceress, gifted with magical talent that surpassed even her older brother Rayon's. Rayon, the family's heir, had always been jealous of Larette's abilities, and though she wasn't supposed to, she often watched him practice magic. However, She had never learned to use her skills properly, as her family focused on training Rayon, while Lariette was left to do menial tasks. Back in the present, Lariette used her magic to suspend the Marquis upside down. A massive vine appeared from the ground and wrapped around his leg, holding him in place. This magic was the result of lessons she'd taken with a teacher who knew of her talent. Looking down at him, Lariette declared that she would only explain herself once, and that he should listen carefully. She leaned in close to his face, grinning as she announced that she had no intention of marrying him. From that day forward, their engagement was officially over. Placing a hand over his mouth, Lariette told him he was nothing more than trash, who valued people only for their wealth. Just as she was about to say more, she was interrupted by the familiar voice of her father. Her mother and father rushed out of the estate, shocked and fearful. They had planned to sell their daughter to the Marquis for financial gain. The head of the family used magic to free the Marquis from the vine, and the man fell from a small height, trembling as he glared at Lariette. He vowed he would never forget the humiliation she had caused him. Her parents immediately rushed to apologize, explaining that Lariette was simply immature and foolish for her age. The Marquis, however, insisted that they pretend the engagement had never happened. Lariette couldn't believe her family. They cared more about money than their own daughter. The Marquis, too, was no better, buying people as if they were slaves. Exhausted by the entire situation, Lariette watched as her father escorted the Marquis to the mansion to calm him down. Meanwhile, her mother scolded her, calling her crazy for ruining everything. Lariette responded that she had actually been too late to do this, and that at least someone in the house wasn't completely mad. Her father, hearing her defiant tone, approached her and slapped her across the face, leaving a red mark on her cheek. Lariette had not expected this kind of punishment from him. He was furious with her, but she felt as though she were in a trance. Each passing minute only made her more disillusioned with her family. Her father demanded to know if Lariette understood what she had done. He explained that he was already determined to pay off the family's debts, but Lariette wasn't going to let him off that easily. She gently placed a hand on her cheek, a faint smile appearing on her face as she asked her parents if it was her fault that the family was in such debt. Why should she be the one to pay for their mistakes? She told them plainly that they had done nothing for her. They had shown no interest in her well-being or love, and her father had only decided to sell her to secure money and fame. To him, she was nothing more than a commodity to be traded. Her mother and father immediately reacted, listing all the things they had provided for her: clothes, food, a roof over her head, and claimed that she owed them for living like a princess. Lariette, looking up at them, retorted that she had done more than enough. She had taken on her brother's responsibilities with the estate's office work and had become nothing more than a bargaining chip to cover their debts. They didn't understand why she was rebelling now. Her father, enraged, insisted that he had cherished his daughter, but now he saw her rebellion as an unforgivable betrayal. He declared that she would be erased from the family register. After hearing her father's words, even her mother became visibly nervous. But Lariette understood that the family's threats were nothing more than words on a piece of paper. She explained to them that, for so long, she had been afraid of hurting their feelings, but now it didn't matter anymore. Bowing her head, she thanked them for everything before turning and walking away. Her father shouted after her, warning that she couldn't take anything with her, but Lariette didn't even look back. She wasn't sure what emotions she was feeling now. Perhaps a sense of liberation? It had seemed like something she longed to do for a long time, but she never had the strength to act on it. As she walked away, her brother Rayon caught up with her, calling out her name. She stopped, but made it clear that she didn't need his company. Rayon, grinning, suggested they would call it a regular farewell. And then he asked, with a hint of arrogance, how she could dare to spoil the family's mood just by being there. He believed himself superior to her, even going so far as to mock her magical ability. Rayon sneered that his sister didn't even know how to properly use earth magic, let alone any other element. Determined to teach her a lesson, Rayon directed a powerful stream of energy at her. Lariette didn't flinch. She knew his tricks were weak. Without hesitation, she pushed his magic back with a wave of her own, the force strong enough to move him from his position. Rayon was taken aback, clearly shocked by her power. His own energy boomeranged, knocking him backward. Lariette stood her ground, the situation now entirely in her control. She managed to trap Rayon in a swirling magical vortex that sucked him into his neck, leaving him panicked and struggling. But Lariette, with a determined look, ignored his pleas and walked away. Once outside, she felt a rush of freedom. Finally, she was away from that suffocating house. She thought of Anne, how she had once cried when her maid had left. Lariette had been desperate to follow Anne at the time, but now she felt a little relief. She had completed 3 items on her to-do list in just one day, leaving only 2 left to accomplish. Since the main character had only 3 months left to live, she planned to make the most of her time. One of her goals was to meet a man with more experience, someone easy to date in the short time she had left. She had already imagined various types of men she would like to meet in the next few months. Though Lariette had some money, she knew it wouldn't be enough to live freely. To truly live without relying on others, she needed more. And to get more, she had to do what she was best at. Opening the door to a rather mysterious establishment, Lariette hoped to secure a better job as a purification magician. Purification magic wasn't as popular or as effective as healing magic, and it demanded a lot of mana. It couldn't be used on people with higher or divine magic, nor could it be used on oneself. When she asked about a position, the employee coldly informed her that they weren't looking for purification magicians. Healing magicians were far more in demand, and Lariette was quickly dismissed, told not to waste their time. After this first failure, Lariette felt defeated. She wasn't sure if she should even bother looking for another job. Just as she began to lose hope, something unexpected happened. 2 men grabbed the bag from her belt and ran off. Lariette immediately screamed, hoping to draw attention to the theft, but the passers-by ignored her. They mocked her for being a purification magician, as if her magic posed no threat. Feeling the sting of humiliation, Lariette decided to act. She called upon her elemental powers, summoning a burst of fire to throw at the thieves. Without hesitation, she ran after them, determined to retrieve what was hers. As the thieves screamed in terror, Lariette knew she couldn't let them escape. They ran, glancing around in panic, but they still clung to the stolen bag. Just then, a man in a tuxedo appeared, walking calmly ahead of them. It was unclear whether he had heard her cries for help, but as the thieves drew closer, he slowly turned his head to face them. When they finally saw his face, it was as if a divine hand had crafted it. His features were nothing short of perfection. Dark hair, thin black eyebrows, and piercing blue eyes. His face was a masterpiece, each part fitting together like a work of art created by a deity. His appearance could be called the most ideal in the world, so striking that it could captivate both men and women alike. However, as the thieves approached, they were hit by an overwhelming, unpleasant smell. Decay, like the scent of rotting corpses. The man looked down at them as though they were insects, and the thieves immediately realized who stood before them. The Duke, Monster Cadell. With a swift motion, the Duke drew a sharp blade and, without a hint of hesitation, sliced through the thieves with one clean swing. They were cut in two, not even a blink of his eye betraying the brutality of the act. The rumours of his nickname, the Monster, were clearly true. Lariette wasn't particularly surprised by this. The Duke picked up the bag from the ground and handed it to her. It was only then that Lariette realised that the coachman who had helped earlier wasn't just any coachman. It was the Duke himself. The Duke, from the most prestigious ducal family in the house and empire, was none other than Esser Cadell, known as the greatest sword in the empire. He was a military genius, having won a war that seemed impossible to win, and was infamous for his cruel leadership. But for Lariette, the most striking thing about him was not his reputation. It was his beauty. His face was so perfect that, in her current situation, she could almost feel it wouldn't be a pity to die looking at him. Though she noticed the unpleasant scent the Duke exuded, Lariette found herself oddly unfazed. His face was so captivating that it seemed to overwhelm all her other senses. She turned away, suddenly thinking that, with a face like that, he would certainly be a popular figure in romantic circles. But she knew he was famous for his composure, which meant that courting him was probably out of the question. The Duke regarded Lariette with indifference, likely assuming she came from a noble family and was unaccompanied. As he stared at her, it seemed he was still searching for something, perhaps something he hadn't yet found. When he took a closer look at her, Lariette realised she was slightly frightened. Not of him specifically, but perhaps because everyone else seemed to fear him. Without hesitation, she reached out and pulled on his sleeve, asking for his forgiveness with a smile. She then asked if the Duke had a girlfriend, explaining that she was simply drawn to his appearance. With no hesitation, she boldly asked if he would be willing to meet with her for 3 months in order to check off one of the items on her list. Realising that her approach might have been a little abrupt, she introduced herself with a smile and asked for his name, apologising for the bluntness of her request. The Duke, looking slightly dumbfounded, answered her question. His voice, deep and resonant, fascinated Lariette, and she immediately complimented him on it. To her, it sounded like music, and she found herself enchanted by his voice. The Duke, however, seemed perplexed. He couldn't understand why this girl wasn't terrified of him like everyone else. He assumed this was some sort of joke, and before she could say more, he asked if she had seen how he had slain the thieves. His cold gaze and aura of death were undeniable, and his reputation as a monster was well earned. Turning away, the Duke told her to stop joking and walked off, casting a few glances back at her. Perhaps, he thought, she was a little interesting, but he couldn't bring himself to take her seriously. Lariette, on the other hand, was thrilled. She found him incredibly attractive, and his charisma only added to the allure. But there was one glaring issue. He didn't have a heroine like herself in his life, and she was determined to change that. Later that evening, sitting in a bar with a drink in hand, Lariette found herself pondering how she could meet the Duke again. As if on cue, she overheard a conversation about the Duke and an information guild. She immediately perked up and moved toward the discussion. One of the men was talking about rumours regarding a purification wizard. Lariette joined them, sitting down at their table and asking about the rumours. They told her that the Duke was under a terrible curse, one so powerful that anyone who got too close to him could smell death in the air. The curse was apparently so strong that only a purification wizard could remove it. While they spoke, Lariette nonchalantly ate from their table, absorbing the details of the conversation. It seemed the Duke was desperately searching for a purification wizard to lift the curse that had haunted him for so long. While Lariette continued to eat, the man at the table spoke about how rare purification wizards were. He explained that this type of magic consumed far more mana than other forms, which made it less popular. It was needed to dispel curses, but more people died from swords than from curses, which is why finding a good purification wizard was so difficult. Listening to this, Lariette began to think that she had to venture into the tiger's den to save Asha. She was determined and would do whatever it took. A week later, she arrived at the right place. Smiling, Lariette approached the Duke, catching him off guard. He was standing next to another man, both of them studying papers. They looked up, surprised, clearly not expecting anyone to arrive so suddenly. Lariette smiled again, explaining that she was sure the Duke might be frightened by their unexpected meeting. Without hesitation, she asked if they could at least start with a simple employer-employee relationship, wanting to approach the situation carefully to avoid scaring him off. Asha was uncertain whether he was surprised or scared, trying to process her boldness, but before he could react, Lariette introduced herself once again, bowing to him. This time, she gave her full name and declared herself the best purification wizard in the entire empire. She boldly stated that she could save the young Duke from his curse, which caused him visible surprise. In return, Lariette didn't ask for money or marriage. Instead, she made a simple request. She needed housing. As she spoke, Lariette handed Asha a piece of paper and asked him to sign it. She then explained that the reason she knew the exact moment to arrive was because of the man standing beside the Duke. She threatened him, revealing that information about the Duke's search for a purification wizard had been leaked, something Asha wouldn't appreciate. In exchange for silence, she had made a deal with him to turn off 3 light bulbs at the entrance as a signal for her. The man, still eyeing Lariette with an unsettling expression, seemed curious to know if she could truly back up her words. He warned that if this was a joke, she would never see the light of day again. Lariette, however, was not afraid. She had studied magic her whole life, and purification magic was no exception. She knew this was her only chance, especially since her time was limited. Lariette grabbed the man's hand without hesitation. At first he was confused, but then it became clear. Lariette demonstrated her magic, focusing all her energy on healing his hand, even if just for a moment, to prove her words were true. As she touched him, light filled the room around her, but the curse consumed much more mana than she anticipated. It seemed to drain every bit of her strength, and when she finally released his hand, she felt completely drained. Asha looked at her, initially skeptical. He had lived with this curse for so long and was certain that nothing could change it. He had been warned long ago that the curse would cause his flesh to rot and spread the smell of death wherever he went. He expected nothing from Lariette, thinking that once again he would be disappointed. But when Lariette removed her glove from his hand, Asha saw something he could hardly believe. A perfectly healthy human hand. The miracle had happened. It was as if the curse had been broken. Lariette, exhausted, handed him her contract once more, urging him to sign it. Moments later, she collapsed from the effort. The Duke, astonished, realized that this was the only miracle that could truly break his curse. He caught her before she could fall to the floor, gently holding her shoulders to prevent her from collapsing. Asha made up his mind then. He would never let this girl go until her work was complete. He gripped her tightly, remembering the terms of their agreement. He would provide her with room and board for the next 3 months. When Lariette finally awoke, she found herself lying in a soft bed in a luxurious room. Asha was sitting next to her, waiting for her to regain consciousness. He explained that she was now in his family's estate, in the Duke's quarters, and that he had brought her there because it was part of the contract. If she found this rude, he offered to take her back to her home. However, Lariette quickly replied that there was no need. A few seconds later, Asha handed her the signed contract, sealing their agreement. As Lariette gazed at him, a thought struck her. The Duke had signed her papers. He had agreed because she was the first person who had been able to influence his curse. Joy surged through her, and without hesitation, she rushed to him. Although a hug might be a bit too forward, a simple handshake would suffice to celebrate. She extended her hand, shaking his, while he looked at her in confusion. The girl reassured him with a smile, promising to take care of everything. Asher, still processing the situation, replied that their relationship would remain professional, just employer and employee. He then wondered why Lariette wasn't afraid of his hands. He couldn't quite understand her. She, on the other hand, suggested that perhaps she wasn't exactly his type, but with a sly grin, she mused that tastes could change for anyone. Asher, slightly alarmed by her words, even expressed his concern, suggesting she was still recovering and should rest in bed. He told her to take it easy today so they could talk tomorrow, then left the room. Lariette, still buzzing with excitement, squealed into her pillow. Her face flushed bright red, thinking aloud that showing someone your face immediately after waking up should be considered illegal. And then, as drug and Dresden was when they shared a bed, she still couldn't understand how someone like him could be so handsome. Meanwhile, Asher stood outside the door, listening to her heartfelt admiration. Her words embarrassed him to the point of madness. No one had ever spoken to him like that before, and it made him feel utterly perplexed. He thought to himself that Lariette was truly strange. The next day, when Asher was busy with paperwork and sipping tea in his office, Lariette unexpectedly appeared, silently watching him. Noticing her presence, Asher decided to ask if she had anything to say. She simply replied that she was waiting for him to stop pretending he didn't notice her. Then, she asked why he hadn't eaten with her earlier. Asher, taken aback, didn't understand what she meant. So Lariette quickly explained that she had been waiting for him because she thought they would have breakfast together. Surprised, he commented that it seemed she had a good appetite. Lariette, a bit confused, didn't quite grasp his point, but Asher interrupted, asking how much she knew about his curse. Pulling up a chair, Lariette replied that she knew nothing about it. Asher explained that it was a curse of the dead, a powerful curse that caused his skin to rot like the flesh of the deceased. He pointed to the bandages wrapped around his body, revealing that they were enchanted to prevent the odor from escaping. Even purification magic only slowed the rotting process, but it could never lift the curse completely. Lariette asked when he had been cursed, and Asher revealed that it happened when he was 7. He added that the curse was incurable, as killing the caster or destroying the curse itself was impossible. He knew it was a hopeless situation. Asher then thought that Lariette might run away from him after hearing such grotesque details. However, he was prepared to do whatever it took to keep her close, since she might be the one who could lift the curse. Unexpectedly, Lariette grabbed his hand, asking if the curse caused him pain. She didn't fully understand what he was going through, but she could tell it must be hard for him. Looking at him, she promised to remove the terrible curse that had tormented him for so long. Asher, staring into her eyes, was at a loss for words. No one had ever treated him like this before, and for the first time, he began to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was hope. Asher turned away, still trying to make sense of why this woman was not afraid of him. On the contrary, she seemed drawn to him. Everyone else avoided him because of his decaying skin, the result of the curse. But Lariette treated him as if he were an ordinary man, looking at him as if he were handsome and charming. This sudden change in perspective made him feel strange, and for the first time his ego stirred. Lariette took his hand once more, determined to ease his torment. She used her remaining energy to work her magic, and Asher, concerned, asked her to stop. But she didn't listen, so he grabbed her hand to stop her himself. As he did, he noticed how delicate her wrists were, and for a moment he couldn't look away. Quickly he turned his attention back to bandaging his own hands and told Lariette not to overdo it. She smiled, saying that she was just checking and wouldn't have enough mana to continue anyway. Looking at her left hand, she noticed it was already looking much better. The cleansing magic was still working within it. Sweat beaded on her forehead from exertion, but she felt the magic still present in his body. She shared her findings with him, explaining that his body could only hold a certain amount of purification magic at once, and until his left hand was fully healed, other parts of his body wouldn't respond to the magic. Asher, pouring himself more tea, processed the information. He was surprised, but he agreed to let her continue cleansing him, albeit cautiously. Lariette reassured him, promising she would take full responsibility and get everything done before her time was up. She took the tea from him and drank it, determined to see her work through to the end. The Duke couldn't quite understand what Lariette meant when she said she would do everything before she died. She quickly clarified that she meant she would complete her work as quickly as possible. After hearing this, Asher decided to ask her a question that had been on his mind. He wanted to know if she was afraid of him. It was clear from the way he hesitated that he had been thinking about it for some time. After all, he thought he looked terrifying. Lariette smiled sweetly, covering her mouth slightly with her hand. "Do I have any reason to be afraid of you?" she asked, her tone light. But then, her expression became more serious. She decided to address the rumors about him, the so-called demon of war. After all, Duke Candle had single-handedly won a war that had seemed destined to fail, earning the title of national hero. Lariette was convinced that envious members of the imperial family had spread these rumors to undermine his influence. She also believed that the curse he bore wasn't a result of his own actions, but rather the malicious intent of the magician who had cast it. Her words shocked Asher. He had long been convinced of his own terrible reputation, but Larette's perspective was the complete opposite. She told him that he was not the source of fear. Only the magician who had cursed him deserved that fear. Lariette gently placed her palms on his face, smiling warmly as she spoke. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice steady. "I only fear that you might not want to see me again." At these words, Asher blushed deeply, suddenly embarrassed by the situation. He immediately asked her to let go of him, feeling flustered by the physical contact and her honest words. Turning away, he quickly suggested they meet for dinner at 7 that evening, a proposition that surprised Lariette. She quickly composed herself and gave a cheerful yes, even though in reality her consent wasn't necessary. Asher, now even more flustered, hurriedly left the room, leaving Lariette alone. As she walked through the corridor later, Lariette reflected on the situation. She realized that Asher was perhaps more sensitive to touch than he let on, as his quick agreement to dinner had seemed to stem from her touch. Just then, someone called out to her from behind. It was Holstein, the loyal butler of the Candle family. He asked if she had met with the Duke, to which Lariette smiled and replied that it was thanks to him that she had found her way to the Duke's office so quickly, which had allowed her to arrange the dinner meeting. This revelation surprised the butler, as he knew the Duke hadn't shared a meal with anyone for a long time. After the death of the former Duchess, the Duke had eaten alone. But now Lariette was going to have dinner with him. Holstein, smiling, asked her to take good care of the Duke. Lariette laughed, saying that they were simply having dinner together. However, it was clear that the butler had a different understanding of the situation. Later that day, Holstein appeared at Asher's office, carrying a large book titled A Guide to Successful Dates. The butler looked at Asher with confusion, but he knew that Asher had been taught meal etiquette as a child and that no new rules had appeared since then. Realizing the book wasn't about etiquette, Holstein felt that it might be about something else entirely. Asher, now looking uncomfortable, realized that he was actually afraid the sorceress, who was 5 years younger than him, might laugh at him during their dinner. Holstein presented the book to Asher, suggesting he read it. Asher, however, was not interested and immediately dismissed the suggestion, saying it had nothing to do with him. He brushed aside the book as if it were useless, which caused Holstein to become somewhat exasperated. In 27 years of service, Holstein had never felt more useful than now. After a few minutes, the butler opened the book in front of Asher and began reading a few of the rules that a man who had invited a woman to dinner might need to know. Asher tried to pretend he hadn't heard Holstein's comment, acting almost like a child before quickly leaving the office, just as he had that morning. Lariette asked if she could make a small change to their contract. Without hesitation, Asher agreed. Moving a little closer, she explained that the payment seemed insufficient compared to the amount of purification magic she had spent. Asher, surprised, noted how directly she spoke. He wasn't used to such frankness, as he mostly only communicated with Holstein. He quickly realized that while money wasn't a problem for him, the contract needed more than just financial adjustments. The additions she suggested were mostly about shared activities, mandatory meals together, walks, and covered expenses. Lariette, with a sweet smile, explained that these additions were, in her words, small dates. Asher was a little taken aback. It seemed strange to him that this was the only thing Lariette was asking for, considering she could have asked for much more. But he realized it would be much harder if she decided to leave, claiming she wasn't paid properly. In response, Asher decided to make his own amendments to the agreement to ensure he wouldn't be deceived. Afterward, he handed her the updated contract, mentioning that he had only added one condition. Lariette meekly agreed, but she couldn't help but think she would cleanse him anyway. So the Duke's fears were unnecessary. Both parties signed the contract, and it was finalized. Then Lariette turned to Asher, asking about a picnic the next day. She had noticed the estate was vast and filled with beautiful spots, and she thought it would be perfect for a picnic. Asher, however, explained that he would be leaving the next day. Not giving up, Lariette asked if they could have the picnic the day after tomorrow instead. Asher couldn't understand the urgency and asked why she was in such a hurry. Lariette, smiling sweetly, replied that it was just as important as winning his love. Asher sighed but agreed. Then they moved to the house. A few days later, Lariette gazed out the window, appreciating the beauty of the estate. She was pleased to live in such a place, and she also noticed that her condition had improved. Her magic had already been restored. Now, she needed to hurry and lift the curse before it was too late. She went to Asher's office, where he had been since early morning. Noticing her, he remarked that she was up quite early. When Lariette saw his hairstyle and outfit, she was momentarily stunned by his beauty, comparing him to the sun. She smiled and said, "The sun named Asher never sets," playfully adding that his face blinded her forever. Asher didn't know how to respond. Then, remembering the picnic, he suggested they hold it during the day, since it would be colder in the evening. Lariette moved closer, sitting at the edge of the table as she listened to him. Asher mentioned that after the picnic, they should return immediately, since he had a lot of work. Lariette asked if he really didn't have time to deal with the curse, which surprised Asher. He hadn't expected her to recover so quickly. Lariette explained that she believed touching bare skin would be more effective, so she had removed his bandage. Asher watched as she touched his hand again, and a bright light surrounded them. Lariette noticed that his hand was no longer as heavily cursed. Just one more touch seemed enough. Asher, looking at his now clean hand, could hardly believe his eyes. He had spent over 10 years searching for a solution, but he never imagined it would be so easy. He turned to Lariette, asking if she was okay since she had felt unwell last time. She grinned smugly, saying that she had gotten the hang of it and that she hadn't used up too much of her mana this time. The conversation shifted to the picnic, and once they moved outside, Lariette seemed a little cold. Asher reminded her that spring mornings could still be chilly. Lariette, clinging to him, replied that there was no point in going back now. They still had a date to enjoy. Asher, slightly unsettled, moved away. Lariette, with a mischievous grin, hinted that she would be much warmer if he gave her his coat. Asher, however, simply answered, "I don't want to." Asher, thinking about how his coat still smelled unpleasant, was surprised when Lariette quickly agreed with him, suggesting that the young master shouldn't catch a cold. This startled him a little. At that moment, Lariette eagerly rushed forward, jumping with excitement as she found a perfect spot for their picnic. She spread everything out and called Asher over, saying the sun was warm there, making it an ideal location. Sitting next to her, Asher couldn't help but remark that she was strange, to which Lariette responded that it was all because of him. She then tried to pull him closer, but he enjoyed the distance between them, which upset her. She wondered if he had been hurt in past relationships or if he simply didn't like her. Though Lariette hadn't had many relationships, she believed that touch was important, and she wasn't going to give up easily. Meanwhile, Asher found himself thinking about how he never imagined sitting on a flower bed. He felt out of place, but Lariette, oblivious to his discomfort, opened the picnic basket. It was beautifully packed, with wine and flowers neatly arranged. Lariette delighted in the sight, and Asher realized it was Holstein's handiwork. His butler had wished them a good walk before they left, and Asher wanted to disappear from embarrassment, but Lariette suddenly turned to him and asked what his favourite food was. He hadn't even considered it and answered that he didn't have one, which she didn't believe. He was supposed to have a favourite food, right? Lariette decided to share her own preferences. She told him she liked salmon sandwiches and didn't particularly like the smell of cucumbers, though she could eat them if she had to. Asher, thinking about it, wondered if she also didn't like cucumbers. She handed him a sandwich, and he thought about how, since she was a purification magician, her scent must also be purified, unlike his own cursed smell. He restrained himself from asking if she could smell it, but still, he didn't refuse and took the sandwich. As he took a careful bite, Asher looked like some kind of deity descended from the heavens, and Lariette couldn't help but admire him in silence, holding back an outburst of emotion. Afterward, she waved her finger in the air and used magic to make all the nearby flowers gather into a beautiful wreath. The wreath gently landed on Asher's head, and he looked up at it, like a small child, with delicate pink petals swirling around him. Lariette gazed at him in admiration, her cheeks flushed with surprise and her mouth agape. However, Asher immediately began covering his face and trying to get rid of the wreath, fearing Lariette would laugh at him. She tried to stop him, asking him to leave the flowers in place, but before she could, the wind swept the wreath off his head. She rushed after it, and Asher tried to stop her, but she didn't hear him. In the end, she fell into the fountain, soaking her dress and hair. The most unexpected part was that Asher, noticing she was about to fall, rushed to save her, and Lariette ended up practically sitting on top of him. Their faces were mere millimeters apart. Asher looked into her eyes and, in a low voice, said it was time for her to stop embarrassing him. He carefully placed his hand on her shoulder, which only made the situation more awkward for both of them. But that wasn't all. Asher, still looking into her eyes, gently touched a strand of her hair and asked what he would do if she caught a cold after all this. Lariette, looking away, replied that it wouldn't happen because she was strong and could withstand any hardships. Asher picked her up in his arms, saying it was time for them to go back. Lariette, embarrassed, asked him to put her down. She couldn't bear how flustered she was becoming. Once they arrived at the estate, Holstein took her temperature, which was higher than normal. Lariette had caught a cold, as Asher had predicted. Asher didn't say anything in response because he already knew. Lariette, embarrassed, admitted it was the first time in her life she had caught a cold. Asher looked at her with a disappointed expression, unsure whether she was joking. Lariette could only quietly ask for his forgiveness. After a moment of silence, Asher explained that he needed to go to the imperial castle and had already called for a priest. Lariette simply responded with a short, "Aha." Asher thought she might ask him to stay with her, but Lariette, though grateful, didn't want to burden him further. She decided to rest quietly in her room instead. After leaving her room, Asher rode in the carriage to the imperial castle. As he sat there, he thought about Larette's family. He couldn't understand how they could allow their daughter to stay on his estate so easily. He also hadn't realized that cohabitation with Lariette would be so difficult. While they were standing still, a white carriage drove past them, and long white hair appeared from the window. As Asher turned toward the carriage, he realized that it was the clergy, heading toward Lariette. He was relieved they had arrived so quickly, but then he noticed, with some surprise, a smile forming on his face. Embarrassed by his reaction, the Duke immediately covered his face with his hand, not fully understanding why he felt that way. The clergy knocked on the door and asked if the patient was inside. When they entered, Larette's face immediately turned bright red, resembling a tomato. It was clear why. Standing before her was an incredibly handsome man with long white hair and cat-like yellow eyes. He smiled warmly and explained that they had come from the temple. Sitting on the bed next to Lariette, the man introduced himself as Doha, a servant of the Elle temple. Lariette introduced herself in response, and he didn't hesitate to reach out his hands toward her head, stating that they would begin the treatment. His gesture confused Lariette, and she lowered her eyes to the floor. When he touched her face, the same light that appeared when Lariette freed Asher from the curse surrounded them. She instinctively raised her eyes to Doha, who was smiling at her. As the treatment progressed, he decided to make small talk, asking how she had ended up here. The question seemed odd and out of place, but realizing his mistake, he quickly apologized, looking away. Zohar explained that due to the Duke's curse, everyone was shunned, even in the temple, where there was a clear hierarchy. He added that, as a low-ranking priest, he was often ignored by others. Lariette remembered hearing that wounds like his were common among low-ranking priests who didn't have the money to seek help from more powerful figures. Once the treatment was over, Doha said that was all, continuing to sit beside Lariette. She stretched her hands, feeling the positive effects of the magic, and thanked him for the treatment. Still, she felt compelled to do something more. She whispered to Doha, asking if he could come closer for just a moment. He complied without hesitation. Lariette slowly placed her hands on his forehead, and once again a familiar light surrounded them as she used her magic to heal his wounds. This act confused her slightly, as it took more energy than she expected. When she finished, the look on Doha's face was one of surprise. Clearly, he hadn't expected a magician to be so skilled, and he was clearly impressed by what had just happened. A somewhat creepy smile appeared on his face as he asked, almost with a hint of curiosity, whether Lariette was a healing magician. Before she could respond, he made an unexpected offer to her. To work for him as a personal healing magician. He assured her they could easily agree on a fair price. Lariette was slightly taken aback, replied that she was busy and couldn't commit. However, Doha, now hovering over her, asked if she might be able to help him later, any time she was available. Lariette answered that it was possible. He smiled at her with his yellow eyes, pleased by her response, As a sign of gratitude, he promised to continue treating her for free. Furthermore, if she healed him, he would repay her properly. Lariette saw this as a good offer and agreed. Doha, clearly pleased, asked if they could now be considered friends and grow closer. As he moved even closer to her, he explained that he wanted to be friends because he truly liked her. A sly grin spread across his face. Lariette, not finding his behaviour particularly strange, simply thought that she had no real friends yet. Before she died, it would be nice to experience friendship. Smiling, she wished him and herself good luck. He smiled back, and, still sitting on her bed in a somewhat inappropriate position, told her to take care of him. After some time, when Doha had already left the estate, he arrived at the temple of Alton. As he entered, a man at the entrance bowed deeply to him, calling him the High Priest Michael Davin, which completely contradicted his earlier stories to Lariette, where he had complained about his low status in the temple. Apparently, his claims were lies. Inside the temple, Doha was greeted by another priest, who remarked that he was tired of the high priest wandering around wherever he pleased. It was then that he noticed the scar on Doha's forehead had disappeared. Placing his hand on his forehead, Doha, with a surprised expression, replied that a sorceress healer had done it. He still found it hard to believe. The red-haired priest was shocked by this revelation, realizing that the healer must possess the same power as their high priest. He couldn't understand how it was possible. Doha, grinning slightly, responded that he was now going to find out everything about this girl and her power. La César la Cézanne. At the same time, Azar had returned and was sitting in the carriage, unsure whether he should get out or not. He didn't want to leave, but ultimately he got out and headed toward the estate. As he raised his eyes to the sky, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had to go to Lariette, even though he knew it was better not to. He didn't understand why he continued to care for her. When he approached the doors, Lariette unexpectedly leaned out to greet him with a smile. Asher was visibly confused, as he hadn't expected her to be waiting for him at the threshold. It was the first time anyone had greeted him like this. Despite his confusion, he decided not to react and asked her to step aside so he could enter. She thanked him for the priest's visit and, as they walked, unexpectedly grabbed his hand. The action took him by surprise. Lariette explained that in 2 days she would be fully recovered. She then placed her hand on his forehead, showing that her fever had subsided and she was feeling much better. However, Asher quickly pulled his hand away, responding with a short, "Aha." He considered her gesture shameless. But Lariette wasn't deterred. She rushed after him, asking if he wanted to see her and if he had thought about her. Blushing, Asher turned away, stating that this had never happened, but it was clear to Lariette that he was trying to hide something. She noticed his strange reaction and pressed further, asking again if he had thought about her. Asher, still blushing, replied dryly that no, he hadn't. Lariette then asked, somewhat teasingly, why he was suddenly blushing. Before he could answer, she shifted the conversation to what he would be doing tomorrow. Asher answered that he would be sorting out papers in the mansion, thinking she might want to purify herself tomorrow, but Lariette had other plans. She pulled out a ticket with a smile on her face and invited him to the show. Apparently she had already purchased tickets for both of them in advance. Asher took a closer look at the ticket and asked what kind of paper it was. Lariette, frustrated by the question, explained that it wasn't just any piece of paper. It had been difficult to obtain. Then Asher asked what the show was. Lariette, excited by his interest, explained that it was a famous performance and that they had premium box seats. Moreover, tomorrow would be the last performance. Without hesitation, Asher gave a firm and short response. "No." This immediately upset Lariette. She couldn't understand why he didn't want to go, but Asher didn't explain the real reason. His curse made him believe that everyone would avoid him and look at him with disgust as soon as he entered a public place. He didn't want to risk that. Asher couldn't understand why Lariette took his curse so lightly. He needed her to realize that not everyone would react to him the way she did. He didn't have the luxury of going to public places. Stopping, Asher looked at Lariette and asked again, his voice heavy. "Are you really not afraid of me?" Afterward, he explained that the rumors about the demon of war were not just fairy tales. Tens, even hundreds, of lives had been lost at his hands. Lariette, listening to this, looked a little frightened and confused. He continued, saying that it wasn't surprising others feared him, for a man who was so close to death was dangerous, not just in scent, but in action as well. She understood, but it wasn't as terrifying to her that she would run away. In response, Lariette suddenly struck Zasha's hand, something he hadn't expected from her at all. The Duke, taken aback, asked what she was doing. Lariette, clearly angry with him, responded, "Peace, Captain, peace, Captain, peace, Captain," her fists slightly swollen from the force of the blow. She exclaimed that she had just dared to attack Duke Candle and wondered what he would do about it now. She added that, on top of that, she often looked at his face, held his hand without his consent, and even called him by his name. As she laid out her grievances, the Duke looked extremely confused. Lariette then asked one thing. Was he planning to kill her after all of this? She couldn't understand why he was speaking about himself in such a way. Grabbing his coat, Lariette squeezed the fabric in her hand, demanding a specific answer to her invitation. Yes or no, and if the answer was no, a clear explanation as to why. She was eager to know whether Asher wanted to go to the show with her or not. His reaction, however, left him in complete surprise. He hadn't expected her to behave this way, and so he silently listened to everything she said. After a pause, Lariette instructed him not to worry about others and to focus on what he wanted for himself, something he had clearly not done in a long time. With that, she turned and walked toward her room, dissatisfied. She asked Asher to give his answer by the next morning, as he couldn't give it right away. She added that if he refused, she would go to the show with someone else. Asher stood frozen, as if he had been brought back from the edge of heaven to earth. He struggled to process whether Lariette was serious, or if all of this was just nonsense. His ears burned from the awkwardness of the situation. Sipping at his milk pitcher in the temporary silence, he realized. The next morning it seemed that the Duke had indeed agreed to attend the performance with Lariette, and she was overjoyed by his acceptance. They had already arrived at the venue, and Asher, like a true gentleman, helped Lariette out of the carriage, offering his hand. She beamed with happiness, but suddenly her leg twisted, and she stumbled. She would have fallen if not for Duke Candle's quick reaction, catching her in his arms. It almost seemed as if Lariette had planned the fall, because she was pleased when she found herself in his arms, even managing to secretly hold his hand. For this, he reprimanded her, but she responded that it was only because he had caught her. Asher, still firm, told her not to do that again. Looking around, he noticed a large crowd of people waiting for the performance to start. Lariette noticed how nervous the Duke seemed, his hands shaking slightly. She grabbed his hand, pulling him along, smiling radiantly at him. She reassured him that everything would be fine, especially since they had a private VIP box. She asked him not to worry as they made their way inside. Once the show began, they settled into their seats, watching an incredible performance with talented actors. Time flew by, and as they exited the VIP box, Lariette shared her excitement with Asher, telling him how much fun she had. He responded that it wasn't bad, to which she added that the lead actor was quite handsome. Asher, curious, asked if she really liked the prince, as he found him extremely ugly. Lariette laughed and replied that she simply appreciated beauty in all forms. Then she told him she was going to the restroom and asked him to wait for her in the carriage. Having finished quickly, she returned, her spirits high, looking forward to a nice dinner after their enjoyable day. But just as she was about to head back to the carriage, she heard someone calling her name, shortening it in an overly familiar way. It was Marquis Segre, who, with a smug grin, did not apologize for his previous rudeness. He seemed to take pleasure in the sight of Lariette, who was smiling brightly, while he casually embraced a lady who looked anything but pleased. Lariette reminded him that she had advised him to avoid meeting her again. Preparing to cast a spell to intimidate him at least a little, she was startled to find that he appeared completely unbothered. Without a hint of concern, the Marquis snapped his fingers. He then stated that Lariette didn't understand the situation she was in. Even if she resisted, her body, being so precious, shouldn't go to waste. At that moment, she was grabbed by 2 pairs of hands. 2 men gagged her and forcibly held her in place while Segre approached, his smug grin never leaving his face. He explained that he had been waiting for this moment because he still couldn't forget the humiliation she had caused him that day. Stepping closer, the Marquis touched her face with his palm and, smiling, suggested that since Lariette had become a commoner, perhaps he should make her his concubine. He promised to treat her with great tolerance, given her good looks. But before he could finish his sentence, something swept his hand away. And suddenly, the heads of the 2 men holding Lariette fell to the floor with a sickening thud. The girl remained frozen, terrified, as Asher stood next to her. The young Duke calmly explained that no matter how long he waited for Lariette, she had still not returned. Now he was here to collect her. He added coldly that anyone who dared touch what belonged to Mr. Candle would die. Looking down at her, Asher suddenly turned to Lariette, asking if she was disappointed in him. Lariette, confused and unable to collect her thoughts, didn't know how to respond. Before she could answer, the Marquis, shaking in fear, intervened, asking Asher if he knew who he was. The Duke regarded him with contempt and, staring him down, asked if the Marquis was seriously speaking to him like that. The Marquis, trembling, could only hiccup in fear, clearly too terrified to respond, his current situation worsening by the second. At that moment, Lariette stepped in, stopping Asher and asking him to wait. She explained that, for now, the Marquis was standing right in front of him, and continuing this confrontation would only escalate things. Asher, with indifference, replied that he was the Duke of Candle, but Lariette stood her ground, insisting it wouldn't change anything. The Duke couldn't understand why he should be concerned. After all, he was recognized by the Emperor and had his favor. Taking the life of some Marquis wouldn't benefit him. But Larry didn't let him dwell on it. Grabbing his hand, she pulled him toward the exit, urging him to just follow her and do it quickly. Without another word, they hurriedly left the scene. Already sitting in the carriage, the main character nervously tried to catch her breath. The Duke, however, thought to himself that he didn't care about Maris. His main concern was saving the girl. He turned to her and asked if she was okay, to which she replied, still out of breath, that she wasn't. Asher, turning away to look out the window, silently mused that Lariette would surely end their relationship now, having seen how cruel he could be. Yet, since they were bound by a contract, he reasoned that nothing else should matter to him. But things didn't turn out as he expected. Smiling, the main character praised the Duke, saying what he did was impressive, and adding that he was even cooler than the character in the play. Hearing this, Asher opened his mouth in surprise. After that, they drove in silence. Lariette still believed it was wrong to resort to violence so often, but the girl admitted that in this case, it had been self-defense. The next day, the same priest came to see Lariette, because, after attending the show, she had caught a cold again. Concerned, the priest asked if she was feeling better, urging her to be more careful. Lariette hadn't expected to get sick so quickly and decided to inquire if it was possible to cure an incurable disease with divine power. She seemed excited yet nervous as she asked. Smiling sweetly, Doha explained that an incurable disease is one that can't be treated by either magic or divine power. If there is any possibility of treatment, then it's no longer considered incurable. This answer left Lariette feeling upset, realizing that everything would still die anyway. But then, smiling wider, Doha added that it might be possible to cure such a disease with divine power equal to that of His Holiness the Pope. What Lariette didn't know was that Doha himself held such power. Using his abilities, the priest saw that the main character's mana chain was curved, a rare case caused by an excess of unbalanced and uncontrolled mana. From what he could tell, Lariette wouldn't die, but would suffer from bone pain her entire life. Healing would be difficult, but not impossible. Recognizing Lariette as a very talented wizard, Doha didn't mind investing in her recovery. He offered to help, saying he would treat her periodically. Upon hearing this, Lariette exclaimed joyfully and expressed her deep gratitude. Suddenly, Doha asked for her forgiveness and, without warning, pulled Lariette into his arms. Before she could even react, she found herself tightly embraced. Doha leaned in closer, apparently placing a healing kiss on her lips. A soft light illuminated the room as he gently held her head, using magic to heal her from the inside. Afterward, he pulled away, stating that the treatment was over for the day. Lariette blushed deeply, like a ripe tomato. Doha added that the procedure would need to be repeated several times. Lariette, still flustered, managed a quiet, "Thank you." Slowly, the priest asked if she could help him in return as a sign of gratitude. Slowly extending his hand, he rolled up his sleeve, revealing a large wound. Seeing it, Lariette gasped in surprise. She gently touched it and asked how he had suffered such an injury. Doha explained that it had happened recently. As he spoke, the room was again bathed in bright light, and the wound instantly healed. Watching this, Doha thought his theories had been confirmed. Lariette, exhausted, collapsed onto the bed, noting that the process had drained too much of her mana. Doha thanked her, acknowledging that it wasn't surprising she had spent so much energy on him, as he was a high priest. He then pulled out a precious stone and handed it to Lariette, saying it was payment for her help. She was puzzled by where he had gotten such a valuable item. Doha, of course, lied and said he had simply picked it up. Lariette didn't expect such a grand reward for just one treatment, so she told him she would treat him as a regular client going forward. Added with a playful tone, she added that there was no other sorceress he could visit except her. The statement made Doha laugh. After that, his expression shifted slightly, becoming more cunning, as if this was what he had been waiting for all along. Doha willingly agreed with the heroine, now determined not to let her go or allow her to escape. The next day, as Lariette walked through the corridors, she encountered the butler. He wished her a good morning and asked if she was looking for the Duke. She confirmed this and asked if he knew where Asha was. The butler explained that the Duke had returned late and was now sleeping, which initially upset Lariette, but then he brightened her mood by suggesting she be the one to wake him. Surprised, she asked if she was really allowed to do that. The butler, smiling joyfully, assured her that it was perfectly fine, secretly thinking how happy he'd be if she not only woke the Duke, but also eventually married him. He gave her directions to Asha's bedroom, and, though nervous, Lariette made her way there, feeling a bit awkward since she had never been in his private quarters before. When she reached the bedroom, she carefully opened the door and was taken aback by how large the room was. Approaching the Duke's bed, she softly wished him good morning. Asha reluctantly lifted his head from the pillow, recognizing the familiar voice, but not fully awake yet. After blinking a few times to focus, he realized it was Lariette standing above him. Squinting, he asked why she was there, still groggy from sleep. Lariette, sitting on the edge of the bed, explained that it would be best to conduct the cleansing ritual in the bedroom and suggested they finish it quickly. Asher, still not fully understanding, asked what she meant. Smiling, Lariette explained that starting from that day, she would be cleansing his upper body, and the curse would only be lifted if she touched his bare skin. Asher was taken aback by this and hesitated. The heroine, approaching him, suggested that he undress, to which he nervously backed away. Embarrassed, he stammered that there was no need for her to do it and quickly began unbuttoning his shirt. Once his shirt was off, he looked away, feeling incredibly awkward. His body was wrapped in bandages, and Lariette gazed at him with wide eyes. Looking up, Asher asked if he should remove the bandages too. Lariette, blushing, replied that the cleansing required contact with bare skin. At this, Asher turned red like a tomato, but, after a moment of hesitation, removed the bandages. Lariette, upon seeing his scarred but enchanted body, was shocked. Asher, in turn, quickly averted his eyes, feeling even more uncomfortable. Lariette was stunned by the sight, realizing that the curse was far more powerful than she had anticipated. Gently placing her hand on his chest, she began explaining that the curse was too great to be lifted in one session, but she promised to do her best. Asher, nervously covering his mouth with his hand, avoided her gaze, feeling more embarrassed by the second as she got closer to him. Suddenly, Lariette stopped, realizing that she had exhausted too much mana. Weakened, she collapsed onto Asher's chest, alarming him. He called out her name, confused because everything had seemed to be going well up until that moment. With her eyes closed, Lariette explained weakly that her mana had been drained because she had healed the Reaper the previous day. Asher, both embarrassed and bewildered, listened as she casually recounted how she had befriended the Reaper and offered to help him from time to time, as long as it didn't interfere with the curse purification. Still flustered, Asher, struggling to understand, asked if she treated the Reaper the same way she was treating him. Lariette, confused by the question, didn't know what he was referring to. Realizing his thoughts had wandered, Asher cleared his throat and mentioned that he always thought priests were usually women. He then told her to do as she wished. Suddenly, Lariette opened her eyes for a brief moment and, with an unexpected question, asked when he would finally fall in love with her. After that, Lariette collapsed into Asher's lap from exhaustion. The man didn't even have time to respond to her question before his expression darkened. He clenched his fist angrily, seemingly blaming himself for her weakened state. Later, Asher began avoiding her for reasons unknown, while Lariette searched the entire estate for him without success. One day, as she sat at a table drinking tea, she shared her frustrations with Lodin, confiding that the Duke continued to avoid her. She couldn't understand if she had put too much pressure on him, which embarrassed her. Lodin, who had become her close friend while they were searching for Escher, listened attentively. Lariette couldn't help but notice that Doris seemed surprisingly good at giving love advice, and from the way he carried himself, she was sure he had been with many women. Doha caught her gaze and smiled knowingly. Then, with a mischievous glint in his eye, he suggested a bold idea. Make Asher jealous. Slowly, he reached out and twirled a strand of Lariette's hair around his finger, gazing at her seductively. He told her that no man could resist the sight of the woman he loves with another. Lariette, a bit flustered, replied that she didn't have a suitable partner, thinking back to her lack of experience with boyfriends or male friends due to her complicated past with her ex-fiance. Her innocence amused Doha, who suddenly placed his hand on the back of her head and pulled her closer, their faces just millimeters apart. Looking into her eyes, he softly reminded her that he was also a man, subtly hinting at himself as a candidate. Holding her close, Doha managed to talk to her while treating her wounds at the same time. Lariette was surprised by his boldness, and the idea of making Asha jealous didn't seem so bad after all. She even allowed herself to imagine Asha begging her not to leave him, pleading with her as he feared going mad without her. The thought made her blush, though she quickly pushed it aside, realizing it would probably hurt Asha in the long run. Lariette thanked Doha for his help, telling him that she would figure out her own way to handle the situation. She was confident that she could win over the Duke without resorting to manipulation, mentally urging Asha to wait for her. Late that night, as Asha quietly returned from his business and tried to slip into the estate unnoticed, a voice called out to him. It was Lariette, sitting on the steps. Her expression stern, almost like a mother who had been waiting up for her child to reprimand them. Startled, Asha froze, surprised and nervous to see her there. He asked why she wasn't asleep. Lariette, a bit flustered herself, replied that she had been waiting for him. She complained that it had been hard to get a glimpse of him recently, as his busy schedule seemed to keep him away. Rising from the steps, she approached him, raising her head to meet his eyes. It was clear to her that it was time to confront him directly. She reminded him of their agreement to take walks twice a week, and asked if he had forgotten. Asha wasn't sure if the ache he felt was from the stress in his stomach or a deeper pain in his heart, but one thing was certain. Whenever he stood in front of Lariette, he felt strange. It was precisely this strange, unfamiliar feeling that had driven him to avoid her in recent days. Not wanting to prolong the discomfort, Asha quickly invited her to take a walk in the garden tomorrow, then diverted his eyes to avoid her gaze. Lariette began to realize that she was the only one truly holding on to their relationship. As long as she continued cleansing him, Asha would be fine, but she also needed to consider her own well-being. After all, her time was running out, and she didn't want to face death by submitting and giving up like she had in the past. Forcing a smile, she suggested that Asha must have been very busy lately, which explained why he came home so late. He then added that he didn't need to feel obligated to walk with her or share meals together if it was too much for him. Lariette smiled faintly, addressing him as Duke, and remarked that he was busy, implying she was only distracting him with everything. How can anyone say they are Duke for the first time when she had always used his name? Asha's eyes widened in shock. Something had clearly changed, but he didn't respond. Lariette continued, saying she would go eat with her priest friend and that she would forego their walks and dinners, giving him the freedom to focus solely on his work. Asha, still speechless, watched as her lips trembled before she quickly turned away and climbed the stairs to her room, leaving him standing there alone, uncertain of what to say. Once in her room, Lariette lay on her bed and opened her notebook, the one her father had given her, much like the way he had once gifted Rayon a sword encrusted with precious stones. She remembered her brother recounting how his skin had tanned from his journey to the west, sharing joyfully about the refreshing air, the pristine water, and the wonderful people he'd met. Lariette felt a pang of sadness, realizing that she had never been on any trips herself. Despite her desire to do so, she'd always been left out of discussions and decisions. Now, she questioned why she couldn't do what she wanted, even in her final days. The reason she had sought a relationship was to create some happy memories before her time ran out, but it was beginning to feel like a burden to Asha. This confused her, especially since he had never shown hostility towards her. In fact, the way he looked at her during the performance had only made things more complicated. Burying her face in her pillow, Lariette thought about how lonely she felt, trying to figure out what to do next. Meanwhile, Doha was changing into more casual clothes, revealing the scars that covered his body. His subordinate, Joshua, noted that Doha had been wearing the robes of a low-level priest too often lately. Joshua found it odd, given Doha's exceptional status and immense divine power. He wondered why someone like him would need to disguise himself. But Doha brushed off the comment, asking if everyone else wore similar attire. Ignoring the question, Joshua then inquired if Doha was planning to meet with that sorceress healer again. As Doha tied his hair back into a neat ponytail, holding the hair tie between his teeth, he answered with a simple yes. Joshua grew concerned, reminding him that the girl served Duke Candel, and if Doha's identity as the future pope were discovered, it would bring shame to the church. Amused, Doha asked if Joshua truly believed he could be caught so easily, but Joshua remained nervous, suggesting that it might be better to lead Lariette to the Temple of Altion, where she could serve the next pope directly. However, Doha shrugged off the suggestion, replying that he was just an ordinary person, before leaving the room. As Joshua watched him go, he couldn't help but think about how interested Doha seemed in Lariette. She was the eldest daughter of the Duke of Blanchett and the fiancée of Marquis Ezra, whose recent actions had been troubling. Lariette possessed powerful healing abilities and a vast reserve of mana, and it was clear that she was a purification sorceress. She had become close to Duke Candel, who sought her help to break the curse that plagued him. It was evident the Duke would spare no expense for her services, and Joshua suspected Lariette was in love with Asher, doing her best to capture his attention. Doha, now seated in his carriage with a sly grin, contemplated how difficult it would be to make Lariette his personal healer and flirt with her while their relationship remained shallow. He realized he would need to put in more effort to win her over, especially since Lariette clearly liked him as well. But despite this, he couldn't quite figure out how to seduce her. As they approached Asher's estate, the door to Doha's carriage suddenly swung open, revealing an anxious Lariette. She asked him if he had any free time today. Surprised, Doha replied that he did, wondering why she needed to know. Without hesitation, Lariette climbed into the carriage, asking him to spend the day with her, to go out, eat and shop together. She explained that they were embarking on the jealousy operation, a desperate plan she had come up with in an attempt to gain Asher's attention. Smiling to himself, Doha eagerly agreed, as if this was what he had been waiting for. His prey had fallen right into his hands, agreeing to his plan under the guise of a harmless operation. He decided to invite Lariette on a date as part of the café. Doha had been growing increasingly frustrated at how long it was taking to be served. As Lariette explained that dessert would take a little more time, she and Doha sat on a bench. Lariette, curious, asked if he liked sweets, to which he replied that he did. Seemingly out of nowhere, she questioned why he was allowing her to treat him. Suspecting there might be some catch, Doha, looking slightly confused and a bit saddened, explained that he typically avoided getting hurt, but they were supposedly forced to seek treatment outside the temple by the high priest's orders for the lower-ranked workers. Hearing this, Lariette gave him a thumbs up, struggling to hold back tears. She sympathetically told him not to worry, assuring him that if his boss ever bothered him, she would gladly take revenge on his behalf. Amused, Doha found her reaction both endearing and a little funny, considering the vast power he wielded. Still, he played along and agreed, intrigued by how far her interest would go. Lariette, thrilled by his response, eagerly began offering suggestions, like setting the high priest's clothes on fire or hanging them from a tree. She enthusiastically promised to do whatever she could to help. Doha thanked her, trying not to laugh. He knew Lariette was capable of using elemental magic and hoped she wouldn't actually act on these ideas, which could inadvertently turn the temple into an enemy. But he reassured himself that it was all in good humour. As they continued strolling through the streets, looking at shop windows, Loretta's attention was suddenly caught by a jeweled brooch displayed among other trinkets. She thought it would suit Asha perfectly. While she was lost in thought, Doha gently placed his hand on her back, startling her. When he asked what had caught her eye, she quickly grew embarrassed and replied that it was nothing. Turning to him with a smile, she added that she was simply admiring the jewellery and thought something would look good on him. Doha, with a smile, encouraged her to go inside and ask about the price, even though he had no use for the decoration himself. Without hesitation, Loretta rushed into the shop. As Doha strolled nearby, he accidentally brushed shoulders with someone. Without a word, he adjusted his clothes and continued walking, but the stranger began shouting, demanding to know why the lower priest hadn't apologized to his elder. The man introduced himself as someone talented, who had become a layman in just 5 years, clearly expecting deference, until he resumed his holdover on the bed. Doha, remaining calm, simply told him not to itch under his ear and to continue on his way. However, the layman was incensed by his tone and grabbed Doha by the collar, yelling that he had no idea who he was dealing with. The layman threatened Doha, boasting of his status and clearly believing himself superior. Doha, growing tired of the situation, considered his options. He thought briefly about using his divine power, enough to burn this man to ashes if he wished, but realized that revealing his true identity wasn't an option, as there were too many onlookers. For now, he decided not to resist, and, with a slight bow, apologized to the elder, even though the situation was reversed. The layman smirked, assuming Doha was finally submitting, but his triumph was short-lived. Within seconds, the layman's clothes mysteriously caught fire. Confused, the man stared at the burning hem of his robe, unsure of what to do, and quickly began screaming. As the flames consumed his clothing, revealing nothing but teddy bear printed underpants, the crowd erupted in laughter. The layman was utterly disgraced in front of everyone. Doha, wide-eyed, realized that the spontaneous combustion wasn't his doing. The entire spectacle left him both astonished and amused. Then he heard a familiar voice, and before he knew it, someone grabbed his hand and pulled him along. With a beaming smile on her face, Loretta tugged him hastily, clearly pleased with herself. Her joyful reaction and the way she quickly fled the scene made it obvious that she had been up to something. Finally, they reached a quiet alley where no one was around, and they disappeared into the bend. Doha immediately asked, "What did you do?" Still catching her breath but grinning, Loretta replied, "I told you, I would take revenge." He stared at her in confusion for a moment, as if trying to decide whether she was being serious, but when she added, "I won't back down if you're in trouble, so don't worry," he couldn't hold back any longer. He burst out laughing, covering his face with his hands. Loretta noticed that Doha was laughing like a true villain, amused by the entire situation. Resting his head on her shoulder, he asked with a mischievous tone, "What am I going to do with you? You're just too interesting." His hand gently wrapped around her neck as he smiled, his voice rising slightly. "It's so fascinating. I want to have you completely." Meanwhile, back at the estate, Asher sat fuming in his room. The butler had just informed him that Loretta had spent the entire day with the priest. Only now did it dawn on him that the priest was a man, not a woman as he had originally thought. The butler, sensing the tension, warned the Duke that if he didn't act soon, things between Loretta and this new friend could escalate beyond mere friendship. Standing in the middle of his room, Asher began to grasp the reality of the situation. He had no idea how far Loretta's relationship with Doha had progressed. As he tried to reassure himself that even if they became lovers, it shouldn't matter to him, images of them walking together, kissing sweetly at the end of their outings, tormented him, Sitting on the bed with his face in his hands, the Duke told himself that Lariette was only there to cleanse his curse, nothing more. Their conversations about dates and affection were fleeting, he tried to convince himself. But his head spun, and he couldn't shake the strange feelings churning in his stomach. Looking down at his hands with disappointment in himself, Asher couldn't understand why he felt this way. Who would want a monster like him? Surely Lariette only pitied him, offering sympathy and comfort out of kindness, nothing more. Yet, despite his inner conflict, he decided that there was no point in lingering on these thoughts. Later, as they sat at the dinner table, Lariette suddenly asked why Asher had called for her. He explained that he wanted to talk after such a long time. She responded with mild surprise, noting that she thought the Duke's busy schedule had been sorted out. But in her mind, she wondered whether her plan to make him jealous had worked. As she looked at his stunning face, she had to hold herself back from showering him with compliments, thinking to herself that someone with such beauty could conquer the world. Asher unexpectedly turned to her and asked how she had been, his voice cold and distant. Lariette, panicking slightly and blushing, explained that she had been spending time with her friend. She glanced up at him, hoping he would show some sign of jealousy. But the Duke, looking away, responded indifferently, as if the question had been asked out of mere politeness, and that he didn't really care about her answer. Determined to press on, Lariette mentioned that Doha would be visiting this afternoon and that they would be in her room. She assured the Duke that he shouldn't worry if anything happened, but even then he remained unbothered, replying that it didn't matter to him. Save for one minor issue, he had been presently betrayed by a Secret Service crew arriving at his door. Feeling flustered, Lariette nervously picked up her fork, took a bite, and then, glancing up at him, asked, "Aren't you even a little jealous of me?" After all, that's what she had been aiming for all along. Slowly, Asher turned to face her. Looking at her incredibly sweet face, he suddenly blushed, struggling to maintain his composure. His mind raced, trying to figure out what to say in response to her bold question. But then Asher immediately answered her, saying that he wasn't jealous and that he didn't care, adding that the only thing that mattered to him was that this did not affect the quality of the purification process. In response, Lariette sighed in disappointment, picking at her food with a fork. She had expected a completely different answer. Abruptly, she stood up from the table, surprising the Duke. She explained that she had lost her appetite and said they'd see each other next time during the purification. With that, she left the dining room. Later, Lariette met with Doha, who had updated his image slightly by wearing glasses. He asked her gently what was bothering her. Sitting on the bed, she apologized. The priest, with a sly smile, thought to himself that Asher, cold-blooded as he was, would eventually regret his indifference. For now, though, Doha saw this as an opportunity to grow closer to her. Sitting beside her, he lightly put an arm around her shoulder, gazing at her sympathetically. Lariette, looking up at him, realized that he had come all this way for her, while she was just wallowing in her own problems. Deciding to lighten the mood, she asked about his glasses, teasing that he looked like a librarian, which suited him. Doha chuckled, suddenly saying he felt an urgent need to write something, as if overcome by a prophetic urge. This ability, prophecy, was a rare gift, possessed only by the most exceptional believers, and was a crucial factor in choosing a pope. Lariette, surprised by his seriousness, asked if he was all right, but Doha shifted the conversation, asking if she really liked his new look. She smiled and called him handsome, adding that everything suited him. Without warning, Doha pulled Lariette closer by the waist, their faces only inches apart. He gently held one of her hands while his other arm wrapped around her waist. Gazing directly into her eyes, he asked if they should begin the treatment now. Meanwhile, in his office, Asher was having a heated conversation with his butler. "It's pointless to interfere," he said, clearly referring to Lariette and Dorothy. The butler observed that the young lady had seemed upset after breakfast. If things ended like this, Asher's invitation had been in vain. The butler added that earlier, Asher had even instructed the cooks to remove all the cucumbers from Larette's meal, something the butler found astonishing, as it was the first time the Duke had made such a personal request for a guest. The butler speculated that Asher was experiencing emotional fluctuations. Since he had been cursed, Asher had distanced himself from others, finding it difficult to feel anything. Now, looking at the Duke, the butler sincerely hoped that he would find happiness. He advised Asher to stop hiding his true feelings. Hearing this, Asher was momentarily confused, but the butler turned to leave, suggesting before he exited that the Duke visit Lariette and her guest. "Don't think about anything but your heart," he advised. Asher didn't know how to respond to such advice. He couldn't tell what his heart was saying. He insisted that he shouldn't feel jealousy or anything of the sort. After all, he believed he was incapable of love. When he had been cursed as a child, he had been told that he would forever symbolize torn flesh. The curse had been cast by a witch, and Asher had lived ever since with the belief that his very presence would bring the stench of death. His heart had never been touched since. Yet, despite his doubts, Asher decided to heed the butler's advice and visit Lariette. He walked slowly toward her room, and as he approached, he noticed the door was slightly ajar. Through the gap, he saw Doha holding Larette's face. From behind, it looked like they were about to kiss. Asher's eyes widened in shock. Without thinking, he stormed into the room, grabbing Doha by the arm and pulling him away from Lariette. Fury flashed in his eyes as he glared at the priest. Lariette was frightened by the sudden intensity, and even Doha himself hadn't expected such a harsh reaction. Asher's eyes blazed with fury, and, in a commanding tone, he ordered Doha to take his hands off her. Despite the tension, Doha wasn't afraid. With a fiery gaze, he greeted the Duke, while Lariette was completely bewildered by the sudden turn of events. The situation had escalated unexpectedly, and the room was charged with tension. Internally, Doha was relieved he had chosen to wear glasses today, as it would be problematic if his identity were revealed so soon. Raising his hands in a gesture of peace, Doha signalled that he wasn't looking for a confrontation, though Asher's demeanour remained fierce, and even Lariette felt a little intimidated. Trying to calm her down, Doha gently called her by her nickname, Larry, which only made her more anxious. She tried to explain that her friend was only treating her and that nothing inappropriate had happened. But when Asher saw Doha's arm around her shoulder and the way he called her Larry, it was clear to him that this didn't look like just a friendly relationship. Asher glared at Doha, who looked back at him slyly, stroking Larette's head in a way that only infuriated the Duke further. Unable to tolerate it any longer, Asher sternly told the priest that he was free to leave. Doha, without protest, got out of bed and walked out of the room. As he left, he adjusted his glasses with a grin, amused by the unfolding drama. He thought to himself that the story was becoming more intriguing by the day, but he wasn't ready to give up yet. Asher sat down next to Lariette on the bed, both of them silent and unsure of what to say. Finally, Lariette broke the silence, reminding the Duke that he had claimed not to be jealous of her. Her face flushed slightly as she spoke, clearly nervous. Asher, his head lowered, remained quiet, his mind racing. He couldn't deny to himself that he had been too emotional. Was he really jealous of her? He often found himself thinking that her kindness could be given to someone else, and the thought made his blood boil. Now, as he looked at her, he realized he didn't want her to hate him. He didn't want to hurt her. After wrestling with his thoughts and emotions, Asher suddenly came to a realization. He wanted Lariette to be his. He had been turning away from his true feelings for too long. Lariette, noticing his silence, nervously asked if she could still meet with Doha, strangely seeking his permission. Asher turned to her, silent for a few seconds, as if deep in thought, before finally asking her not to do it. His face flushed as he continued, asking Lariette not to leave. It was as though he had held that request on the tip of his tongue for so long, and now it had finally slipped out. He admitted that he had never imagined his heart could beat so fast. With his head lowered, Asher explained that even when he didn't want to, his thoughts always drifted back to her. He confessed that just imagining her with another man made him want to cut off the hand that had touched her. Larette's mouth dropped open in shock as she listened to his unexpected confessions. She had never thought she would hear such words from him. Then Asher, lifting his gaze to meet hers, admitted that if this was what jealousy felt like, then yes, he was insanely jealous. As he reached out a hand to touch her face, he stopped midway, fearing he might hurt her. He continued, saying that he felt lost, unsure of where these strange emotions were taking him, but despite his confusion, he finally asked Lariette if her offer for a romantic relationship was still valid. He confessed that he liked her. Lariette, wide-eyed and trying to process everything she had just heard, suddenly smiled. A blush spread across her cheeks as she joyfully gave him her answer. Yes, she wanted to be with him. She threw herself into his arms, surprising him. Asher, embarrassed, blushed deeply as he awkwardly hugged her back, his heart racing wildly. Moving slightly away from him, Lariette smiled and declared that she looked forward to their relationship with great excitement. Asher, still stunned by everything, quietly echoed that he was looking forward to it as well. He couldn't believe what was happening, that this was real. For him, this was a first, a new experience of love, something he had never imagined for himself. As they sat together, each was lost in their own thoughts. Lariette dreamed of spending the next 3 months with excitement and joy, while Asher was already making grand plans for their future. He imagined renovating the garden, picturing Lariette living in the house with him for the rest of their lives. After some time, Lariette decided to present Asher with a list of plans that they could carry out together. She eagerly awaited his opinion and perhaps a few suggestions of his own. Curious, Asher asked what the list was for, and Lariette explained that these were activities they would do together. But as he skimmed through the list, Asher's heart sank. There were so many things he felt he couldn't do because of his weakened body. He flipped through the notebook, hoping to find something else, but Lariette abruptly stopped him. "There's nothing important beyond that," she said nervously, her heart racing. She didn't want him to see the next pages, where she had listed her private wishes. More importantly, she didn't want him to discover that she was terminally ill, especially now that they had just begun their relationship. When Asher saw a crossed-out item on the list, city tour, he tensed immediately, knowing who she had spent that day with. Though he didn't say anything, the thought gnawed at him. Sensing his discomfort, Lariette quickly explained that it was merely a wish list, not something she specifically wanted to do with her boyfriend. Seeing his tense expression, Asher, trying to mask his feelings, suggested that she didn't have to fulfill all the points with him. But instead of feeling relieved, Lariette burst into laughter. "You're so cute when you're jealous," she teased, and Asher was stunned. No one had ever called him cute before. Blushing slightly, she leaned closer, looked him straight in the eyes, and softly said that she wanted to complete every item on the list with him. Only him. She then asked, in a sweet voice, if he liked her plan. Before Asher could respond, Lariette hugged him, her excitement bubbling over like a child's. She told him how much she loved the idea of doing all these things together. Soon after, they found themselves in one of the Empire's finest boutiques. Lariette was thrilled to be in the city with Asher, and as they browsed through the beautiful clothes, she tried on a stunning dress. She looked like a living doll in it. Stepping out to show him, she asked, "What do you think?" Asher was speechless, his mouth slightly open in surprise. The shop attendants helped her select more dresses, but Lariette was curious about Asher's opinion. Yet he remained silent. After a while, Asher quietly said that she didn't need to choose any of the dresses because he was prepared to buy her everything she liked. He even offered to buy her all the jewelry she had admired, and he kept his word, purchasing every item she had tried on. When they were riding home, the carriage was overflowing with boxes of clothing and jewelry. As they rode, Lariette suddenly asked why he hadn't responded earlier. Confused, Asher asked what she meant. She poked him lightly in the stomach and reminded him of her question about the dress, why he hadn't said anything back at the boutique. She poked him again playfully, and Asher, turning away in embarrassment, quietly admitted that he had been too flustered to respond. He thought Lariette had looked so beautiful in the dress that he had been rendered speechless. Lariette, feigning indignation, teased him for taking too long to compliment her. She continued poking him in the side, insisting that if he thought she was beautiful, he should say so immediately. The gentle touches flustered Asher, and he quickly grabbed her hand, trying to stop her. Holding her hand, he looked straight into her eyes, and gathering his courage, he finally told her, "You are truly very beautiful." Asher was so close to her now, the distance between their faces barely noticeable. Lariette, narrowing her eyes and blushing, asked if he honestly thought she was beautiful. Then, with a bold smile, she suddenly asked him to kiss her. The request embarrassed Asher deeply, but Lariette, resting her hand on his shoulder, was ready for the kiss. Asher, on the other hand, was not. Their faces inched closer, and just when they were about to kiss, the coachman's voice suddenly interrupted them. He announced that they had arrived, asking where to move the luggage. Startled, the couple froze, staring wide-eyed at each other. Embarrassed beyond words, Asher bolted from the carriage the moment the door opened, leaving Lariette behind, surprised and confused by his sudden departure. A few days later, Lariette, dressed beautifully for dinner, sat down at the table, feeling a bit sad. Since their interrupted kiss, there had been no progress in their relationship. Asher, always the gentleman, still treated her with care, straightening her napkin as she sat. But Lariette couldn't help but feel that their relationship hadn't changed much since before they were together. Time was slipping away, and she knew she didn't have much left. As Asher took his seat, Lariette, with an innocent smile, playfully asked him to feed her, making the first move that he seemed too shy to take himself. After this, Lariette added softly that she wanted to receive love from her lover today. Asher, the Duke, was puzzled. She seemed perfectly capable of eating on her own, so why did she need this? Still, he didn't want to refuse her. Picking up a piece of salad with his fork, Asher carefully and slowly brought it to her lips. Lariette leaned forward and quickly ate the small bite, smiling warmly at him. Suddenly she rushed to hug him, saying how kind he was and that he was the best man. Asher was incredibly embarrassed by her affection. When Lariette hugged him even tighter, his face turned as red as a ripe tomato, and he felt like he was burning with shame. Flustered, he quickly stood up from the table, mumbling about how much work he still had to do. Without waiting for her to respond, he hurriedly left, even as she tried to stop him for just a few more minutes. Asher simply waved a quick goodbye as he fled, leaving both Lariette and the butler bewildered by his sudden departure. It was then that Lariette realized something. Perhaps the Duke only wanted a platonic relationship. This thought struck her as a disaster, and she slumped forward, lightly hitting her head on the table in frustration. She wasn't entirely certain yet, but it weighed heavily on her mind. A few days later, Lariette visited Asher's bedroom. She opened the door slightly, announcing that she had come to perform a cleansing. As she walked in, she resolved that even if she didn't have much time left, and even if Asher didn't like her touch, she would accept it. After all, what kind of love was it if it caused discomfort and suffering? Smiling sweetly, she told him they would work on his upper body today. Asher, though embarrassed, began to unbutton his shirt slowly, preparing himself. Lariette watched, thinking about how handsome he looked as he undressed. Once his chest was bare, he sat quietly on the sofa, nervously saying he was ready. The Duke was still uncomfortable with the situation, especially with his girlfriend so close and about to touch his bare skin. Lariette approached him, gently starting the cleansing process. Asher tried to distract himself, thinking of anything else, but then Lariette stopped suddenly and leaned her elbows on his chest. Concerned, Asher asked if she was all right. She quietly reassured him, saying she was feeling better than before, but was still a bit dizzy. Blushing slightly, Lariette asked if she could hug him. Asher, looking into her eyes, blushed deeply and explained that it was hard for him to restrain himself. It wasn't entirely clear what he meant, but he turned away, gently holding her by the shoulders and suggesting they keep some distance. He admitted that he could be somewhat impatient. Lariette, excited, grabbed his hand and looked into his eyes, telling him he didn't need to hold back. He could do as he wished. Something seemed to snap in Asher at that moment. In one swift motion, he threw Lariette onto the sofa and hovered over her. Both of them were suddenly embarrassed by the intensity of the moment. Asher asked again if he truly had her permission, wanting to be sure that she wouldn't mind if he did what he desired. Lariette, thinking she had only wanted a simple kiss, realized the situation had quickly escalated. She felt as though Asher might devour her. His powerful body, heavy breathing, and intense gaze all hinted at his overwhelming desire. He gently took her hand and began covering it with soft kisses. Overcome with embarrassment, Lariette called out his name, stopping him halfway. She pulled her hand back, pressed it to her face, and quietly apologized, looking into his sea-blue eyes. Asher, trying to collect his thoughts, realized he needed to stop before things went too far. Gently helping her up, he asked her not to put them in such a situation again, explaining that next time he wouldn't be able to let her go so easily. Lariette promised she wouldn't act so thoughtlessly again. The Duke apologized for frightening her as he began to get dressed. He realized he, too, needed to be more careful, because he didn't know what might happen if they found themselves in a similar situation again. A few days later, Lariette, once again emboldened, practically sat on top of Asher, playfully suggesting they finish what they had started. Without much shame, she leaned in and gave him a long-awaited, sweet kiss on the lips. How the rest of the story unfolded remains to be seen. One morning, a few days after the cleansing, Lariette expressed her desire for Asher to take her on a date to a restaurant. She showed him a list of ideas, but Asher declined, explaining that even something as simple as going to a restaurant would be difficult for him due to his curse. The eyes of others always saw him as a monster, and they were wary of him. With sadness in his voice, Asher apologized to Lariette, regretting that she, as the beloved of a cursed man, would have to give up so much. Looking at her bright, unwavering smile, Asher felt guilty for not being able to give her what she deserved, but Lariette, gathering her strength, smiled even more radiantly and reassured him that the location of their date didn't matter to her. The only thing that was important was that they spend time together. After hearing this, Asher smiled joyfully as they continued their conversation. However, in the midst of their discussion, the Duke completely forgot about his responsibilities. Lariette, noticing this, decided to remind him by gently pushing him toward the door, telling him he would be late for his duties at the palace. Asher agreed, adding that he would return to her very soon. He thought to himself that he would finish his work quickly, then come home to have dinner with her. They could enjoy a relaxing evening, talking over a drink and discussing interesting topics. He planned to ask her about her day, how she had adjusted to her new surroundings, and what kind of alcohol and snacks she preferred. But the meeting turned out to be far longer and more tedious than expected. After an hour of pointless discussion, Asher, frustrated, decided to speak up. He asked the men present how long they intended to keep up this useless argument. Upon hearing this, the room immediately fell silent. Even the emperor was taken aback. However, one man grew indignant at the duke's blunt behavior, especially in front of his majesty. Angrily, he slammed his fists on the table. Asher, crossing his arms, understood that the father of his beloved Lariette was the one speaking. He wasn't sure whether to ignore the outburst or take action, but it was clear from the man's reaction that only a single glance from the duke was enough to put him in his place. The emperor, considering the situation, decided it was time to bring the discussion to an end. With the word "end" spoken, Asher immediately rose from his seat and rushed home. Larette's father was furious at what he considered an impudent departure, seeing it as an affront to his authority. One of the gentlemen next to him remarked that Asher was incredibly fortunate, for he knew just how fierce the duke could be. He was puzzled as to why this man was so eager to challenge him, and, with a sly grin, he advised the irate father that, if he wanted to save his family from decline, he needed to be much wiser. Larette's father, beside himself with anger and shame, stormed out of the hall. He walked down the corridor, clenching his fists in frustration. In his mind, he blamed everything on his daughter. If only someone had managed the household better, perhaps their finances wouldn't be in such a mess. Furthermore, with his son-in-law, Rayon, spending recklessly, the family situation was worsening. His wife blamed him for Larette's decision to run away, claiming it was because she hadn't received proper education. However, as long as Rayon worked for the imperial family, they still had money. Still, the situation was only deteriorating day by day. Lariette was the only one who had dared to confront him, and he thought that if she returned and apologized for her actions, everything would be fixed. He believed that if she cried and repented, he would show mercy and welcome her back into the family. As he walked further, he asked himself where else Lariette could find a father as wonderful as him, mentally urging her to return before it was too late. Later that evening, Lariette, clearly out of breath, hurried into one of the rooms to ask the butler where Asher was, since he was no longer in the hall. The butler, smiling sweetly, explained that the Duke had gone to change clothes, but was concerned about leaving Lariette waiting. Hearing this, Lariette calmly exhaled. Just then, Asher appeared behind her, having arrived quietly. He asked, teasing her if she was running, noticing how short of breath she was. Lariette, startled, turned around and asked when he had arrived. Asher, stroking her hair and smiling, reassured her that there was no need to meet him in such a hurry, though it was clear how much he appreciated her eagerness. As they moved to the sofa, Lariette, still embarrassed, reflected on the Duke's experience with relationships. She couldn't help but wonder if, with such a body and face, this could truly be his first love. Asher, looking at her thoughtful expression, couldn't understand what she was thinking, especially since her face seemed to change with every passing moment. They were suddenly distracted by the butler, who, using magic, began to perform extraordinary tricks. Fruits floated in the air, and bottles juggled themselves. Both Asher and Lariette were amazed by the spectacle. The Duke, particularly surprised, hadn't known his butler could do such things. The butler, bowing his head proudly, explained that as a butler, he was trained to do everything. After hearing this, Asher immediately left the room, wishing the couple a pleasant night. After a while, Lariette and Asher clinked their glasses joyfully, toasting to each other's health. Asher thought to himself that it was enough for him that they were together. Lariette, however, poured more alcohol for herself, drinking quickly. Asha watched with concern and asked if she was drinking too fast, but she reassured him that she was fine and asked him not to worry. While she continued drinking, Lariette reflected on how alcohol had been her only solace before leaving home. Asha, noticing her mood, asked her how the drink tasted. She immediately shared her opinion and then told him that before his arrival she had walked through the garden. She mentioned that the fountain where they had once fallen into had no water, which had disappointed her. Asha listened intently, his face lighting up with love, as if every word she said was the most interesting thing in the world. He gazed at her with affection, and she, in turn, looked at him with the same warmth. Then Lariette suddenly brought up Doha, explaining that he was just a friend and had helped her a lot with her relationships. Feeling a bit embarrassed, she asked Asha if it would be all right for her to continue her treatment with the priest, as he was the best healer she knew. She added that it wouldn't matter if Asha was against it. Asha, unsure about the nature of the treatment, couldn't understand what kind of treatment she was receiving. He sensed that she might be hiding something, but decided it wasn't his place to ask, especially if it was for her health. He didn't want her to hate him, so he advised her to do whatever she felt was best for herself. Lariette smiled sweetly in response, and then, without warning, laid her head on his shoulder. She straightened her dress, feeling unusually warm, and began to unbutton it. The alcohol in her blood made the task difficult, so she suddenly grabbed Asha's hand. He was extremely confused and didn't know how to react. She placed his palm on her chest, which only confused him more, leaving him speechless. Lariette, gazing up at him, asked him to help take off her dress, holding his hand in place. Lariette swore. As the situation grew more intense, Asha pulled his hand away and asked if she was drunk. He was genuinely worried because she was acting strangely. But before he could process everything, Lariette pushed him onto the sofa and sat on top of him. She looked at him, smiling, and asked if he wanted to continue where they had left off last time. Asha's heart raced, and he tried to maintain control, reminding himself to be patient and resist his own desires. He thought she was just drunk, and that's why she was behaving this way. But as he thought about it, he realized just how drunk she really was, and his concern deepened. He covered himself with his hand, trying to stay calm. He asked Lariette to get off him, explaining that he knew this wouldn't end well. She smiled and giggled, replying that she would only get off if he fulfilled her wish. It was clear that her behavior didn't embarrass her or cause discomfort because of her intoxication. Asha, turning away, said he would do whatever she wanted. He tried to force himself to think of something else, to clear his mind of any bad thoughts. Lariette, smiling joyfully, asked him to kiss her. The request made Asha feel even more awkward, but he understood that she only wanted a kiss, and nothing more. So he gently placed his hand on her cheek and, leaning in, asked her to keep her promise. The distance between them grew smaller, and she closed her eyes, anticipating the kiss. However, Asha did things differently. He placed a neat, gentle kiss on her cheek. Even this simple kiss embarrassed him greatly. But Lariette wasn't satisfied with just that. She immediately took the initiative, placing her hand on his face and leaning in to kiss him. Asha tried to stop her, but she managed to steal a kiss from him. Lariette, feeling victorious, broke away, smiling like a mischievous cat. She thought to herself that this was the real kiss she had been waiting for. Asha, wide-eyed and stunned, couldn't believe what had just happened. The kiss had lasted much longer than he had expected, and he found himself struggling to process the situation. Angrily, he asked her to know when to stop, but before he could react further, he swiftly threw her onto the sofa, hovering over her. Holding her wrist with one hand, he looked into her eyes and insisted that they needed to take things in moderation. Lariette, still trying to process his words, felt her eyelids growing heavy and her vision blurred. A few seconds later, Lariette opened her mouth wide and fell into a deep sleep. The alcohol had clearly affected her, something Asher hadn't anticipated. He sat next to her on the sofa, feeling strange. He couldn't believe that the girl who had just stolen his first kiss was now lying beside him, asleep with her mouth open. The next morning, Lariette happily barged into Asher's office, shouting a cheerful greeting. Asher, looking slightly tired, noticed that she had finally woken up. But, judging by her carefree and joyful expression, it was clear that she remembered little of what had happened the previous night. Scratching the back of her head, Lariette began questioning him. She only remembered asking permission from Doha about the treatment, but after that, everything was a blur. Asher was shocked. Lariette seemed embarrassed by her body's reaction to the alcohol and quickly tried to explain herself. She usually tolerated alcohol well, but apparently it didn't mix well with cocktails. Asher was only now realizing that she had stolen his first kiss, and she didn't even remember it. His expression turned stern as he suddenly told her that from now on she was strictly prohibited from drinking alcohol with anyone else. Lariette was taken aback and indignantly asked why, explaining that others had told her she drank well. The mention of others made Asher's mood darken. He wondered who exactly she was referring to, replaying her words in his head. A hint of jealousy crept in as he thought about it. Meanwhile, Lariette hesitated, thinking that it wouldn't be fair to tell him the truth, given how many women he must have had in his life. How many addresses he must have loved. At that moment, the butler appeared at the door, smiling as he informed them that a priest had arrived to see Lariette. When Lariette turned towards him, she noticed the sudden change in Asher's expression. He ordered the guest to be escorted to the living room. When Lariette entered the room, she found Doha sitting on the sofa, still wearing his glasses, seemingly for secrecy. He crossed his legs with an air of authority and smiled sweetly when he saw her. He mentioned that they hadn't seen each other for a while. Lariette, a little embarrassed, apologized for how she had hastily escorted him out the last time they met. Doha reassured her that it was nothing, and as she sat next to him, he gently stroked her head. He added that he had no regrets, and if she truly felt sorry, she could visit him next time. He subtly hinted that it was a relief to avoid unnecessary things, as they were now surrounded by servants who were watching their every move. Doha clearly understood that Asher had arranged this situation on purpose. Turning to him, Lariette asked if they could change her treatment. Doha immediately inquired if Asher had forced her to make the change. Lariette clarified that she was doing it because it was something she personally cared about, her relationship with Asher and her contact with other men. Doha understood, but the thought of her being involved with Asher clearly made him uneasy. Smiling at her, he gave his consent but warned that the treatment's effectiveness might be slightly reduced. Lariette thanked him, and he carefully took her hand, pretending to be upset. The priest, with a hint of sadness, then asked if their friendship would end because of this change. Lariette, who didn't want to upset him, immediately assured him that this wasn't the case. She apologized for possibly disappointing him, but she had no intention of ending their friendship. Doha, sensing the tension, asked if Lariette would like to go to the library with him. Confused, she asked if he meant to visit today. Doha confirmed it, explaining that the library was still open. Since Asher seemed to be busy, Lariette agreed, assuming they would go as friends. However, just as they were about to leave, Asher's voice suddenly rang out behind them. He stepped into the doorway, looking tense. Noticing the way Doha was eyeing him, Asher asked if there was a problem with him accompanying them to the library. Doha was clearly displeased, and hadn't expected Asher to show such interest in a place he usually avoided. It was evident that jealousy was at play. Doha stood and bowed to Asher, introducing himself as a priest of lower rank. Asher, however, didn't acknowledge him. Lariette looked at him with a dissatisfied expression and then asked if he had said he would be very busy that day. Asher, looking down at her, replied that what mattered now was spending time with his girlfriend. Lariette blushed, clearly not expecting such a sweet response. She lowered her eyes in embarrassment. Asher returned to the matter at hand, asking if he could join them at the library. The atmosphere between him and Doha was tense, as both exchanged stern looks. But then, with a forced smile, Doha replied that of course Asher could join them. It would be an honor. Asher, satisfied with the response, asked the butler to prepare a carriage for them. In the carriage, the couple sat next to each other while Doha sat across from them. The atmosphere was slightly tense, though Lariette, ever joyful, hoped her friend and lover could become friends, allowing them all to spend time together. As Doha gazed out the window, he was gripped by a strange unease. It felt as though he shouldn't be going anywhere. He was shocked. He asked the Duke if they were heading to the Imperial Library, and his suspicions were confirmed. Doha was alarmed, knowing that many people in the library would recognize him. Disguising himself there would be problematic. Thinking quickly, he told the couple he had forgotten an important errand at the temple, hoping to avoid scandal by returning immediately. Lariette, unaware of anything unusual, supported his decision, saying he could go. When the carriage stopped, Doha hurriedly exited, thanking Lariette and apologizing to the Duke for his abrupt departure. After a hasty farewell, he left. As the carriage started moving again, Lariette turned to the Duke with a smile and joyfully announced that this was apparently turning into a date at the library. She gently took his hand and they rode the rest of the way in silence, feeling a bit awkward. Both were as red as tomatoes, with Asher, the Duke, trying to calm himself by reminding himself that he was a man, not an animal, and nothing untoward would happen in such a situation. On arriving at the library, they wandered through the shelves. Lariette soon noticed how loosely Asher was holding her hand and teased him, saying that at this rate she might fall. But Asher was preoccupied with how small and delicate her hand felt, as if it might break with the slightest pressure. Lariette then wondered aloud if their real purpose for visiting the library was because of Doha's earlier request. She had no idea what they could actually do here, so she decided to explore the library, with Asher following her like a loyal puppy. Lariette found this endearing and, after stopping abruptly, playfully pulled him into a hug and whispered for him to stop following her around like a puppy and instead find a book to read. Asher blushed and asked if she really had to whisper that, especially in such a manner. Lariette reminded him they were in a library and needed to be quiet. She then sent him off to pick a book while she did the same. As Lariette reached for a book on a high shelf, she imagined Asher would soon appear to help her, but instead, a stranger handed her the book, clearly hoping to flirt. Disgusted, she looked into his eyes and sternly told him to leave, giving him no opportunity to pursue his advances. The man left, frustrated by her rudeness, but Lariette paid him no further attention and returned to her plan of catching the Duke's attention. This time, it worked. Asher approached and gently took the book from the top shelf for her. Turning, Lariette teasingly asked if he had witnessed her previous struggle with the book or how she had so boldly dismissed the stranger. Asher smirked and whispered that he liked her assertiveness, but asked her to only behave that way toward other men, not him. He replied with a grin that it didn't, but warned her that if she ever tried to run, Duke Candle would find her no matter where she went. As they walked through the corridors of the Imperial Palace, they chatted about their shared love of brownies and debated the merits of different toppings, eventually agreeing that brownies with ice cream would be the perfect treat when they returned. However, their conversation was interrupted by a familiar voice. Lariette turned in shock, knowing Rayon stood before them, displeasure written across his face. He greeted the Duke with a stiff bow and then turned to his sister, noticing how happy she looked. Lariette panicked, unsure of what her brother wanted. She feared he might say something cruel, as he often did, and embarrass her in front of Asher. Desperate to avoid a scene, she gently touched Asher's hand and asked if he could return without her, explaining that she needed to speak with her brother. Asher offered to wait, but Lariette insisted it would take a while, and reluctantly he agreed, leaving the siblings alone. As soon as Asher was gone, Rayon crossed his arms and sneered, incredulous that Lariette was wagging her tail for the Duke. Lariette snapped back, warning him to watch his words if he didn't want to be buried in the Imperial Palace's backyard. Rayon nearly shouted in anger, accusing her of causing a stir at home and embarrassing their family by living with the monster Duke. Lariette grinned bitterly, asking if there was anything left to disgrace. Rayon countered that their mother had fallen ill because of her, and went on to belittle her, warning that just because she had magical talent, it didn't mean the world would bow at her feet. He sneered, saying that she was just obsessed with the Duke monster, and suggested she return home, where there was plenty of work waiting for her. Lariette gave a firm, clear response to her brother, saying she didn't care. Not a single muscle twitched on her face as she told him they should sort out their household affairs themselves. Her brother, shocked by her boldness, reacted violently. Blinded by rage, he swung his fist and struck her hard across the face. The blow was so powerful that she fell to the floor, while his hand throbbed from the impact. Onlookers began to whisper, watching in disbelief. Lariette, holding her cheek, was stunned that her brother had actually hit her. Her wide eyes reflected the shock, but as she gathered her thoughts, she knew she couldn't let this go. Rayon continued his public tirade, humiliating her in the corridor, shouting that she should never try to surpass him, her older brother. Lariette, though tempted to use magic in retaliation, knew that doing so in the palace would create more problems. Rising to her feet and standing before her brother once again, she considered the rumours that would spread if they continued fighting, especially since she didn't want Duke Candel to find out she'd been beaten by her own brother. Then, in a swift and unexpected move, Lariette delivered a sharp blow between Rayon's legs. He doubled over in pain, unable to even cry out. With a smirk, Lariette declared that she didn't care and stormed out of the palace. Realizing more than 2 hours had passed, she decided to visit a doctor to treat her cheek. When she arrived, the female doctor assessed the damage and touched Lariette's cheek gently, revealing that her cheekbone was injured from the strong blow. After a quick healing attempt, Lariette looked in the mirror and was disappointed to see the bruise still visible. The doctor explained that a higher-level healer or priest would be needed for complete healing. Lariette left the clinic, pondering how difficult it was for those without wealth to access proper medical care. Feeling embarrassed about showing up to Ear like this, she wondered what to do next. Suddenly, a familiar hand rested on her shoulder. Turning around, Lariette saw Madame Chabet, who immediately expressed concern over why she was out so late alone. After some brief conversation, Madame Chabet invited Lariette to her boutique, thanking her for all the dresses she had donated. Lariette agreed, and soon they were inside the shop, where the Madame picked out a stylish headpiece for her. Madame Chabet, sensing her distress, shared how her boutique was a haven for people with their own struggles. She put her hands on Lariette's shoulders and expressed her hopes that the rest of her day would be better. Moved by the woman's kindness, Lariette thanked her sincerely, realizing how comforting it was to know she wasn't alone. Madame Chabet called her by name, surprising Lariette, who hadn't realized she was recognized. They had never met formally before, as Lariette's close ties to her brother had kept her distant from the Madame and the Princess. But now, Lariette no longer considered herself part of the Blanche family. With a warm smile, she asked Madame Chabet to simply call her Lariette, and the Madame happily agreed. Returning home, Lariette was met by a worried butler and concerned servants. They had clearly been looking for her. She was touched by their concern, feeling grateful for the people in the mansion who cared for her. Then, familiar footsteps approached quickly. Asher, more worried than anyone else, rushed to her side. His eyes were filled with panic and concern. Lariette felt guilty for making him worry, but was also pleased to see how much he cared. Apologizing for her lateness, Lariette smiled, explaining that time had flown by after reconnecting with her family and making a few purchases. Asher, though still clearly worried, didn't press her further. Instead, he extended his hand and invited her inside. Just as she placed her hand in his, the hair she had been trying so hard to hide her bruise under slipped, revealing the injury. Asher's expression darkened immediately. He gently brushed her hair aside, examining the bruise. With gritted teeth, he asked who had done this to her. Lariette tried to figure out how to explain the situation, but it was clear she could no longer hide the truth. Asha deduced that it was a blow from a fist, and that a low-level healer had attempted to treat it. Lariette was shocked by his precise assessment. Remembering how protective Asha could be, she became nervous, realizing how dangerous it could be for the one who hurt her. Asha, still frowning, declared that whoever did this would pay. Lariette, now worried, took his hand and softly apologized for causing him concern. She insisted that she could handle the situation herself and didn't want to waste his time on it. Asha reassured her that everything was fine, but he couldn't let the incident go so easily. He told her he would call a priest to heal her properly, which brightened her mood. While he didn't pry further, the Duke remained deeply troubled, unable to simply forget what had happened. Asha, while in his office, summoned Gerard, the leader of the scouting squad, who knelt respectfully before him. Without turning to face him, Asha ordered Gerard to investigate and report back. Gerard, understanding the gravity of the command, swiftly left. Staring out of the window, Asha was consumed with thoughts, trying to figure out who had attacked Lariette. Something must have happened after he left, but that wasn't his only concern. The situation within the Blanche family troubled him deeply, and he needed answers. As much as he hoped it was just his own worries, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. Meanwhile, in the main temple of Elle, an important annual meeting of high priests was taking place. Michel, one of the key figures, felt nothing but boredom as the meeting dragged on. Suddenly, one of his subordinates entered the hall, calling for him. This interruption outraged one of the high priests, who scolded the newcomer and criticized Michel for not managing his staff properly. Michel, amused by the man's reprimand, agreed sarcastically, adding that he would indeed take better care of his subordinates. He beckoned the interrupter closer, who whispered that a letter had arrived from Duke Candle, stating that the sorceress was looking for Michel, due to feeling unwell. Without hesitation, Michel excused himself and left the meeting, ignoring the protests from the other priests. After his departure, they began gossiping, saying Michel was unfit to become pope and favouring Gibraltar Faro instead, who seethed with resentment at Michel's back. Michel soon arrived at the garden, where Lariette was waiting for him. She turned and greeted him joyfully, and he responded warmly. As he approached her, he gently took her face in his hands and examined the bruise on her cheek. Though Lariette seemed a little anxious, Michel's expression shifted from concern to barely contained anger. He demanded to know who had hurt her, but Michel, while healing her, speculated that it could have been Duke Candle who harmed her, but Lariette quickly denied it. With a sweet smile, Michel reassured her that if the Duke had been responsible, she wouldn't have survived. Despite his attempts to coax the truth from her, Lariette stayed quiet, and Michel found himself both frustrated and amused by her loyalty. He resolved to find out who was responsible, knowing that if Asha didn't get to them first, he would deal with the offender himself. As they sat together, Michel asked Lariette to give him her hand. Trusting him, she extended it, and he placed a bracelet on her wrist, explaining that it contained divine power and a mild healing effect. Lariette was shocked by the gift and protested that it was too expensive, but Michel waved her concerns away, insisting it was a gift from a friend. Michel, smiling, told her not to worry and asked her to spend more time with him in the future. Back in his office, Asha was reading a book the butler had given him about maintaining a strong relationship with his girlfriend. The book warned against rushing physical intimacy, stating that it could overwhelm a girl. Asha was stunned and horrified at the thought of Lariette becoming tired of him, or worse, wanting to break up. The idea filled him with dread, and he couldn't shake the memory of the person who cursed him, telling him that no one could love a monster like him. Determined not to lose Lariette, he vowed to be cautious. Later, during a cleansing session in Asha's office, Lariette was focused on healing him. She was relieved that it was taking place in the office and not in his bed, as the last time had left her blushing and flustered. Meanwhile, Asha struggled to maintain his composure, holding on with all his strength. After a few seconds, the girl suddenly raised her head and said that everything was ready. The Duke immediately asked if she was okay, to which she replied that she was, just tired. As she helped him put on his shirt, the man felt guilty for wanting anything more from someone so weary. He thought he was too greedy, and to prevent Lariette from becoming even more tired, he decided he shouldn't trouble her with his insecurities about his body. Asher looked sad, thinking that the only way to keep Lariette from leaving him was by doing whatever he could to not burden her. Lariette unexpectedly interrupted his thoughts by shoving a notepad in his face, asking if he wanted to cook something together, as she wanted to try cooking with her boyfriend. Asher, embarrassed by how close she was, pushed her away, covering her face with his hand. She then playfully asked if he liked the idea and suddenly kissed him on the hand, teasing him by looking up at him through her lashes. Asher, blushing deeply, quickly pulled his hand away, while Lariette asked again about the cooking plan. Later they arrived at the kitchen, which was set up perfectly, almost as if designed for a sweet couple to enjoy. Even the butler had prepared everything meticulously. Asher admired it for a moment. Lariette found an apron and offered it to him, but Asher, imagining how ridiculous he'd look in it, declined, saying it wouldn't fit. Lariette, on the other hand, had her own ideas, and was disappointed by his refusal but quickly shrugged it off, suggesting they cook without aprons. As they started cooking, Asher continued to wrestle with the idea that he needed to talk to Lariette soon, before it was too late. He didn't know how to tell her about his fears, his worries that his body was ugly, his fear of touching her, and his insecurity that she might grow tired of him. They both smiled, each thinking about different things, he about their relationship and she about cooking. While cooking, they laughed and enjoyed themselves, Asher laughing freely for the first time in a long while. After a while, they finished their culinary masterpiece, a beautiful dessert adorned with strawberries and chocolate. Lariette playfully stabbed a strawberry with a fork and fed it to Asher, who, despite feeling awkward, opened his mouth and ate it. When a bit of strawberry remained at the corner of his lips, Lariette teasingly reached for his face. Asher, blushing, was caught off guard as she kissed him and then playfully licked the strawberry from his lips, claiming he was dirty. Asher, not sure how to respond, was left speechless. As Lariette smiled at him, Asher couldn't help but think about how charming she was. Memories of their first kiss, when they were drinking, flashed in his mind, but this moment felt even more romantic. Lariette took a strawberry and deliberately smeared chocolate on her lips, teasing him again by asking if he wanted to clean it off. Asher reached for her but hesitated, clenching his fist in doubt, before backing away. Lariette didn't understand what was wrong until Asher nervously asked if she was okay. He was worried that Lariette might grow tired of him and didn't know how to handle the situation. Lariette, concerned, asked if everything was all right, but Asher suddenly wiped her face with a napkin and left the room, leaving her bewildered. She couldn't understand why he had walked away this time, just as he had done before. The next morning, as Lariette was getting ready, she reflected on their strange dynamic and resolved that they needed to talk. She compared Asher to a wild animal, fearful and difficult to approach, but she believed she just needed to be patient. Determined, she went to breakfast with a smile, confident that the Duke wouldn't be able to escape her today. As she entered the dining room, Asher greeted her, calling her sorceress, just like when they first met. Surprised, Lariette asked why he was calling her that again, but Asher ignored her, pretending to read a newspaper. His strange behavior puzzled her, and she asked if he was angry. He denied it, but Lariette still found it odd. Smiling, she apologized, playfully calling him cute. Asher, hiding behind his newspaper, felt conflicted, thinking that Lariette hadn't taken his request seriously the previous day. He feared she might eventually grow tired of him. Gathering his courage, Asher reminded her of the conversation they had about pacing their relationship. Lariette, wide-eyed, realized she had misunderstood him. She had thought he was talking about the pace of their cooking, not their relationship. Embarrassed, Asher stuttered an apology, and Lariette giggled, poking him and teasing him for being upset over something so innocent. Feeling ashamed, Asher tried to leave, but Lariette grabbed his wrist, stopping him. She asked seriously if he was going to run away from her again. Blushing, he asked her to let him go, but she playfully replied that she wouldn't let him go so easily. When Asher quietly said that her grip was painful, Lariette immediately released him, concerned. Taking advantage of the moment, Asher hurriedly left the room, leaving Lariette behind, trying to figure out what had just happened. As Asher rushed outside, His thoughts were filled with self-criticism. He felt pitiful, convinced that Lariette would eventually tire of him. But as he glanced back, he saw her standing by the window, teasingly showing him her fingers like horns. They both smiled, their earlier awkwardness melting away. From that day on, Lariette followed Asher everywhere, teasing him about holding hands and warning him not to run away. Despite his embarrassment, Asher couldn't help but smile, finding joy in her playful company. A few days later, while Dad was sitting at the table having breakfast, the girl suddenly remembered that, during her teasing of Candle, she had forgotten something important. She couldn't quite understand what exactly the guy had meant by holding off. Looking at him now, Lariette found herself thinking that she wanted to move forward with him as soon as possible, while she was still relatively healthy. Besides, they had signed a contract for 3 months, and now there were only about 10 weeks left. Determined to clarify, the girl asked Issa what exactly he meant. Slowly, he inquired if she was referring to the progress of their relationship. She confirmed his guess. Blushing slightly and without raising his eyes, the Duke explained that he wanted to take things as slowly as possible. His words seemed to pull Lariette out of reality for a moment. Asher deliberately avoided her gaze as he ate a piece of meat. But then, suddenly, Lariette blurted out loudly to the entire hall that she wanted to move forward with Candelaki soon. The maids who overheard this dropped their dishes in shock, standing with their mouths agape, unsure of what to do. The butler quickly escorted them out, muttering something about prolonging the family line. Realizing what she had said aloud, Lariette froze, while Asher turned as red as a tomato, sitting with his mouth open in disbelief. Embarrassed, Asher stammered, asking what she meant by her outburst. Smiling, Lariette replied that she was talking about hugs, kisses, and the like. Before she could finish, the Duke hastily shoved a piece of bread into her mouth, as if to silence her. He sat, staring at her with a confused expression, clearly not wanting to hear any more. Then, as if trying to change the subject, Asher began talking about how his body was slowly decaying from the curse. It was clear that this topic troubled him deeply. As she chewed her bread, Lariette listened attentively as he continued to explain that his skin had torn in places, and that the area around his heart was covered in scars. The Duke believed these scars made him hideous, earning him the title of monster. It was because of this that he found close contact with her difficult. Feeling guilty, the Duke apologized, but the girl, smiling gently, reassured him that nothing could be done about it. Determined, Lariette told him that she had no choice but to work even harder to lift his curse. Asher was taken aback by her words and looked at her in surprise. She took his hands and promised to take good care of him, vowing to break the curse as quickly as possible. After that, she teasingly added, he would surely want to move forward with her. Her words seemed to spark something in Asher. For the first time, his heart fluttered, a strange sensation he hadn't felt before. It was as if his heart was ready to leap from his chest. Overwhelmed, Asher gently pulled Lariette into his arms, and she responded in kind. As they embraced, Asher tried to understand whether these feelings were love or something entirely different. Later, as Lariette lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she thought about how urgently she needed to cleanse Asher from the curse. Rising from bed, she decided she would start with the upper part of his body, even though she knew how difficult it would be to lift such a powerful curse. Who could have placed such a curse on him? Lariette realized it had to be the work of a skilled magician who harbored deep hatred for Duke Candle. She finally understood how difficult it must have been for Asher to live with this curse. Even dating her had been a test for him. Reflecting on this, a sudden thought occurred to her. She might not have been his first lover. However, her intentions were simple. She wasn't seeking a serious relationship, but merely wanted to check something during these 3 months. The next day, Lariette followed the butler, thinking she was being stealthy. However, the butler quickly turned around, catching her off guard, and asked if she needed something. Startled, she hadn't expected to be discovered so easily. He explained that a butler's skill was being observant, though Lariette found no connection between those skills and surveillance. Smiling, the butler guessed that she wanted to ask about Essa's power, wealth, or perhaps whether the Duke could make her happy. Nervously, Lariette shook her head and, after a moment, hesitantly asked if Asher had been in a relationship with anyone before her. The butler visibly tensed, thinking carefully about his response. Smiling slightly, he told her that as far as he knew, Asher hadn't been with anyone before her, although he wasn't certain of all the details. Lariette laughed, asking if her question had been silly. The butler respectfully bowed before they both went their separate ways. As Lariette walked down the corridor, she spotted Asher and called out to him. He immediately turned toward her, just in time to catch her as she flung herself into his arms, her face beaming with joy. Lifting her slightly, he gazed into her eyes, but reminded her gently that running in the hallway was dangerous. Lariette, still smiling, asked if he had been coming to see her. Asher confirmed her guess. After a few moments of silence, Lariette asked him for a hug. Confused, Asher looked at her blankly, but she reminded him that he had allowed hugs. With that, she pulled him into one of the nearby rooms and closed the door behind them. Tentatively, he placed his hands on her shoulders, hugging her gently. She asked if they could continue, but Asher was visibly embarrassed. He held her close, hiding his face in her hair. The warmth of his body comforted her, and everything seemed perfect, until she felt something pressing against her. The mood shifted abruptly, and Lariette blushed deeply, hoping it was just his sword. Asher quickly pushed her away, his face flushed with embarrassment. He stammered that it was enough for now. The Duke, mortified, could only hope that she hadn't noticed what had just transpired. Although the situation was not at all what it seemed, Lariette only pretended not to understand, but she knew everything immediately. Closing her eyes, she thought about how Asher was a strong man in the prime of his life, and apparently she need not worry about the curse affecting the lower half of his body, something she'd been thinking about all night. Trying to cope with himself, Asher decided to ask a random question about the bracelet on Larette's wrist. He had noticed she had been wearing it often lately. Lariette raised her hand, smiled, and asked if he liked it, explaining that Doha had given it to her. She said this absent-mindedly, but then it dawned on her that perhaps she shouldn't have mentioned it so casually. Asher's face darkened with jealousy, and he immediately thought he should have destroyed this man earlier. But he quickly remembered the advice from the book. Jealousy, especially too often, was a sign of weakness. Placing her hand on his shoulder, Lariette gently explained that it was a gift made through Doha's divine magic to help with her health. Asher, with a slightly wild look in his eyes, muttered that he understood, but in his mind he was already imagining how to rid himself of this other man. Lariette, sensing his unease, asked again if he was truly fine. Finally, pulling himself together, he added indifferently that it was fine if she spent time with Doha in his absence. Hearing this, Lariette immediately threw herself into Asher's arms, overjoyed by his words. Seeing her happiness, Asher smiled softly, pleased to have brightened her mood. The next day, Asher shared with Lariette that there were issues with the Danube kingdom on the outskirts of the Hassan Empire, and he had been summoned to an emergency meeting at the palace. Lariette bid him farewell, wishing him a safe journey. However, he lingered at the door, as though expecting something more. Confused, she asked if he needed to use the bathroom. Embarrassed, he quickly said no, and suddenly placed a purple brooch in her hair. Surprised, Lariette froze as he carefully adjusted it. When he finished, he explained with a gentle smile that it was a gift and that it suited her perfectly. Blushing, Lariette stammered her thanks, realizing that he was likely still a bit jealous of the bracelet from Doha, but she couldn't help finding his jealousy endearing, especially when paired with his loving gaze and affectionate touch. Before leaving, Asher gave her a final tight hug, saying that it would be her dose of hugs for the day. Lariette stood speechless, not sure how to react as Asher, blushing slightly, finally left. She waved after him as his carriage departed, and just then Doha appeared, smiling warmly as he greeted her. Noticing the new brooch in her hair, he lightly touched it and complimented how beautiful it was. Lariette thanked him with a smile, the small act instantly lifting her spirits. After the healing session with Doha, the two headed into town for lunch, talking and laughing. Doha seemed surprised when Lariette insisted on paying for both of them, as he had covered their last meal. When they passed by a shop window, Doha pointed at a bracelet, saying that it had caught his eye, and Lariette was more than happy to buy it for him. After a small struggle with the clasp, Lariette helped fasten it onto his wrist, teasing him that he should ask for help when he needed it. Grateful, Doha gave her a sweet smile, remarking how nice the bracelet looked on him. However, the cheerful mood shifted when Doha noticed a small bag in Larette's hand and asked what it was. She casually replied that it was a gift for her lover, and Doha's face briefly changed, though he managed to hide his displeasure with a forced smile. As they continued walking, he brought up some rumours he had heard, particularly about Duke Asher cutting off the hand of the Marquis of Segra at the theatre. Lariette tensed, thinking he was referring to an incident with Rayon, but she played along and confirmed that Asher had indeed been protecting her during the confrontation. Though she felt relieved to admit it, Lariette couldn't shake the fear that her parents might find out she had been at the theatre with Asher. The thought terrified her, especially if they demanded that Asher be punished. Panic started to set in, and Larette's mind raced with worry. Doha, sensing her anxiety, gently cupped her face and asked her to look at him, assuring her that everything would be fine. His words were filled with warmth, and his gentle touch helped calm her nerves. Lariette, though still anxious, nodded, trying to believe his words. As they continued their walk, Doha joked about becoming a high-ranking priest, though in truth the title was nearly impossible to achieve. His teasing managed to pull Lariette out of her dark thoughts, and she smiled, feeling comforted by his light heart. Just as things seemed to settle, disaster struck. The wall above them began to collapse unexpectedly, sending massive stones hurtling towards them. In that moment, Lariette acted on instinct, using her limited defensive magic to shield them both. But she knew her abilities might not be strong enough to save them, and she resolved to protect Doha even if it meant sacrificing herself. She laid her magic, hoping it would be enough to save him. Doha noticed her intentions, and as Lariette closed her eyes, ready to accept her fate, she waited for the inevitable crash of the stones. While Larette's mind was preoccupied with thoughts of Asher and his smile, something incredible happened. Doha shielded her with his body, preventing even a single stone from hitting her. To him, her life was more important than anything. After some time, people began gathering around the scene, staring curiously at the ruins. Lariette slowly regained consciousness, and the first thing she saw was Doha holding back the falling stones. Confused, she couldn't understand how she was still alive. The priest, standing over her, shouted in concern, calling her crazy for what she had done. He was using the same shields that she had conjured for him to protect her. Lariette smiled weakly and told him that the most important thing was that he wasn't hurt. He looked at her with terrified eyes, wanting to say so much but unable to find the words. He was deeply worried, unable to imagine what might have happened to her if he hadn't intervened. Seeing his distress, Lariette urged him not to make any sudden movements, reminding him that if the shield broke, they would both be crushed by debris. She reassured him that she was still controlling the shields with her magic. In that moment, Doha stood up, showing that he wasn't concerned about the stones. With a single gesture, he threw them aside and asked, frustrated, why she had done that. Still on the ground, Lariette looked at him with confusion and asked what he meant. His question seemed strange to her. Doha, however, was deeply concerned. He wanted to know why she had put up shields only to protect him, leaving herself vulnerable. Lariette couldn't understand his anger, as she didn't think her life mattered as much as his. To her, his safety was more important. Lying there with him hovering above her, she explained that they were friends. Doha was at a loss for words, completely bewildered. He thought she was absolutely insane for risking her life for someone she had only met a few times. He didn't believe in goodwill or altruism. In his opinion, everyone only pretended to be good in order to gain some benefit. But when it came to Larette's actions, he couldn't understand her reasoning. What would she gain by saving him and dying in the process? As Doha looked at her, he struggled to comprehend whether her selflessness was genuine, or if something else was at play. Suddenly, Lariette perked up, rejoicing that they were both alive and that Doha wasn't hurt. She began praising him, admiring how impressively he dealt with the wreckage, and teasing that he was so close to promotion that he had no time for these trivial matters. Still worried, he asked if she was hurt, helping her to her feet. Doha, slightly exasperated, explained that with the number of shields he had cast, it was impossible for him to get injured. However, he noticed that Lariette was wounded, despite her pretending otherwise, which irritated him. Placing a hand on her shoulder, he began healing her while firmly asking if she realized how close she had come to dying. Lariette, with a calm voice, responded that it was fine, stating that everyone dies sooner or later. Pulling her closer, Doha declared that she could not die because he would not allow it. This statement shocked her. Holding her by the shoulders and looking into her confused eyes, he resolved that he could forgive her for thinking of someone else while being near him. After all, he still had time. But Lariette couldn't die without his permission. He urged her not to be so reckless about her injuries. Lariette, noticing how alarmed he was, thought that he must have been deeply shocked. Dodi glanced back at the rubble and realized that no matter how old the building was, it couldn't have collapsed on its own. Puzzles formed in his mind, and he began to suspect something was amiss. Meanwhile, Lariette, observing his irritated expression, was surprised. She had never seen him so angry and couldn't believe he was capable of it. Nevertheless, she was glad her friend was unharmed, which warmed. At sunset, Lariette returned to the estate looking utterly exhausted and drained of energy. Asher met her at the entrance, slowly descending the stairs in a tight black sweater. Overjoyed, she rushed to hug him. He reminded her that she had asked him to come early. When she hugged him, Asher asked with a chuckle if she had forgotten that they had already hugged that morning. Lariette couldn't recall, but didn't mind. He returned the hug warmly, but his expression suddenly changed, as if sensing something was wrong. Asher asked what had happened to her today, concerned there had been an accident. He sniffed the air and commented that there was a faint smell of dust lingering around her. Lariette tensed, comparing him to a dog, and marveled at how he had figured it out. She was worried that telling him the truth would cause a commotion, which she wanted to avoid. Looking up, she quickly came up with an excuse, claiming she had simply tripped on the road. Asher, still worried, asked if she had been hurt. She reassured him it was nothing serious and mentioned that Doha had treated her. However, the Duke began gently examining her for injuries anyway, wrapping his arm around her shoulders as he asked if she had fun today. She smiled and replied that she had. His expression tensed slightly at her answer, but before he could dwell on it, Lariette clung to him again, explaining that she enjoyed spending time with him even more. Burying herself in his chest, she thought about how sweet he was and how she needed to lift his curse quickly. She knew how much Asher suffered because of it, and she desperately wanted to help him. During the past 3 months, Lariette had grown determined to ensure he enjoyed their time together. She couldn't bear the thought of leaving him to suffer alone once she was gone. Later, in Asher's office, Lariette sat on his lap, gently touching his bare chest as she prepared to begin treatment for his curse. Asher, noticing her pale and shaky appearance, asked if she was okay. Lariette assured him she was fine, but in truth she was exhausted, having spent all her strength earlier to protect Doha. Seeing how weak she was, Asher grabbed her hand, concerned. Her entire body was trembling, and after a few moments she collapsed into his arms. The Duke panicked, asking if she was all right. She whispered that she felt cold, shivering uncontrollably. Without hesitation, Asher wrapped his arms around her, trying to warm her up. He began muttering about needing to cover her with something as she weakly mumbled about wanting warm water. Asher immediately stood up, scooping her into his arms. Lariette, barely opening her eyes from exhaustion, insisted that she wanted to take a bath. He promised to ask the maids to prepare one right away, but Lariette, looking up at him, added that she didn't want to be with people she didn't trust and asked the Duke to help her with it instead. Blushing at the request, indecent thoughts flashed through Asher's mind. However, seeing how frail she looked, he quickly set aside his embarrassment. Carrying her to the bathroom and preparing the water himself, he stayed by her side, asking if the temperature was all right. Lariette nodded weakly, saying it was fine. Her hair was tied up, and she wore an incomprehensible red outfit. Lariette was indignant, asking if she had to sit in this. The man replied, "Yes, for my sake." When Asher attempted to get up, Lariette grabbed his hand, warning him that if he tried to run away from her again, she would run away too. Upon hearing this, Asher slowly turned around, staring at her with a disapproving look. He clearly didn't like what he had just heard. Lariette, holding onto his wrist, noticed his gaze and quickly released his hand, immediately beginning to make excuses. She explained that she would only run away within the mansion, almost as if they were playing a game of chase. Asher took a moment to process, then quickly apologized for his earlier reaction. He followed with an unexpected comment about how he had been thinking of tying her up, clearly saying it seriously. Lariette patted him on the shoulder and laughed, assuming he was joking. However, judging by his expression, it was clear he wasn't. Despite this, his gaze softened and a smile crept onto his face. Larette's mind suddenly sparked with an idea. She began eyeing him with a sly, fox-like grin and casually started a conversation. She asked if he would like to help her wash her hair. The question greatly embarrassed the Duke, causing him to stiffen in surprise. He tried to pretend he didn't understand what she meant, but cold sweat trickled down his forehead as panic set in. Lariette smiled reassuringly and explained that she was simply asking for help with her hair. Exhaling in relief, Asher agreed to assist. Carefully lathering shampoo into his hands, he began massaging it through Larette's long hair. While doing so, he accidentally noticed a small scar on her neck. He asked where it had come from. Lariette, her eyes distant, explained that as a child Rayon had allegedly pushed her down the stairs. He had then told their parents that she was the one who pushed him, and they believed him, scolding her for playing on the stairs. She continued, explaining that there was no real harm done, though the memory still lingered. As Asher listened intently, he tensed up, realizing with a jolt that he should have dealt with Rayon long ago. Larette's voice softened as she recalled the punishment, being locked in a room as a child. She remembered sitting by the door waiting for someone to open it, her small tears falling as she waited for hours. Even then she obeyed her parents because her mother had told her it would teach her patience. Despite the pain, she endured it all. Suddenly, Lariette changed the subject. She asked Asher if he liked her hair. The question seemed odd, but she explained that someone once told her that just looking at her hairstyle made his eyes hurt. She didn't mention that it was her ex-fiance. Asher, curious, asked who had said that. He half-jokingly added that if she called his name, he would tear out his tongue. Lariette laughed, asking the Duke for his opinion. He replied that he couldn't understand how her hair could be considered unattractive. Turning to face him, Lariette smiled and asked again, this time more earnestly, if he thought it was beautiful. Asher, stammering slightly from embarrassment, assured her that everything about her was beautiful. Placing her hand over his, Lariette gazed into his eyes and asked him to kiss the part of her he found the most beautiful. Without hesitation, Asher kissed a strand of her hair, never taking his eyes off hers. He explained that, for him, nothing about her could be considered unattractive. Lariette, blushing, responded that he needed to choose the part of her he wanted to kiss the most. This time Asher didn't hesitate. He gently placed his hand on the back of her head, pulling her close to kiss her. The kiss was tender and sensual, and they both held hands, their eyes closed as droplets of water fell from Larette's wet body. But now Lariette had no time to think about that. Pulling away, Asher visibly blushed. Lariette placed her hands on his face and praised him, calling him a good fellow. Laughing, she promised that next time she would kiss him instead. Asher didn't answer, his expression still flushed with warmth. A few days later, the couple stood near the boutique. Lariette asked Asher if he would like to have a drink with her in the evening. He reminded her that she had wanted to choose clothes, so she asked if he would help her with the selection, but once again the man insisted that Madame Sherbet. Annoyed, Lariette playfully hit Asher on the shoulder. She was frustrated because he couldn't help with even the most basic things. However, after the blow, she immediately felt a sharp pain in her hand. Noticing how hard Asher was, she realized that her hit had been more like a massage than a real strike. Taking a closer look, Asher noticed Gerard in the distance, who was helping him search for Larette's brother. Gerard urgently needed the Duke, so Asher warned Lariette that he would be leaving for a while, before running off without further explanation. Lariette, still feeling unsettled, was about to leave when she heard the voice of Lady Sherbet calling her to stay for a few minutes. Turning around nervously, Lariette saw a familiar face. It was her mother, who looked at her anxiously, as though waiting for this meeting for years. The woman pointed at her, fear in her eyes. "Where have you been all this time?" her mother asked, rushing toward her and placing a hand on Larette's shoulder. Her voice was filled with worry. Loretta, however, immediately shrugged her hand off and raised an eyebrow, coldly explaining that she had been relaxing at massages and shopping at boutiques, things her mother never seemed concerned about. "Don't you know who I am now?" Loretta quipped with a grin. "I'm a duchess." Her mother felt ashamed and turned away, unable to meet her daughter's gaze. "I couldn't do anything," she muttered. Loretta, unable to take it anymore, sharply responded that her mother could have, but simply chose not to. Slowly, she looked up at her mother and quietly said goodbye, as though a piece of her heart was being torn away. Without waiting for more excuses, Loretta turned and ran away from the boutique, sprinting down the empty streets as if trying to escape from the nightmare of the encounter. But just as she was about to disappear into the distance, someone grabbed her wrist, stopping her.